Chapter 462. The night in the capital was always deep, especially in such a cold winter. After nightfall, there were not many pedestrians on the streets. No, it should be said that there were no pedestrians at all. There were no pedestrians, only night walkers. Who knew how many night walkers used the cover of the night to appear under the eaves of the streets and alleys of the capital? They used the nooses, sharp blades, iron drills, chains on the doors, and powder in their arms to wrap around someone's neck, cut someone's throat, tear someone's body, or blind someone's eyes. Blood blinded everyone's eyes. In Purple Bamboo Park, a black rope hung down from the main gate. A person was struggling on the rope, his feet kicking helplessly in the cold wind. The lantern was very dark. Just like the rope, it swayed slowly in the cold wind, casting shadows and faint light randomly on the ground. At the corner of the street, Deng Ziyu's pale face flickered. He looked like a devil in the night. He stared at that person, and after confirming that he was dead, he turned and left. In Geely Lane, inside a brothel, the red waves were rolling. On the bed, the expert with strong muscles suddenly opened his eyes. His white eyes were seeping with blood. The prostitute on his body looked at him coldly. Her legs were wide open, but she tightly gripped his waist. Her posture was obscene and fatal. After an unknown amount of time, the prostitute's delicate white hands slowly moved away from the man's ears. She pulled out two extremely thin iron drills. The drills glowed with a faint blue light and a pitch-black color of blood. In Gaoshan Tower, a chaotic sound of pursuit rang out. A person panicked and ran down the tower with a face full of fear. The clothes on his body had already been cut into countless pieces and were dripping with blood. A moment later, he was blocked by his pursuers under the tower. The black-clothed man who was chasing him spat out a mouthful of bloody saliva and waved his hand. The black-clothed men rushed up and surrounded the man. Although the man was highly skilled in martial arts and resisted with all his might, he was still like a whale surrounded by a school of sharks. Gradually, he was unable to hold on. In the dark night, only the muffled sounds of metal piercing into flesh and the sound of the cold wind could be heard. The black-clothed men silently stabbed and swung until the man in the middle no longer had any reaction. He did not even have the slightest neurological reaction. He only crawled on the ground like a piece of rotten meat. Yen Bingyun placed the report on the candle flame and burned it. His hands did not tremble, and his brows were no longer furrowed. Since it had already happened, there was no room for doubt. It was just like after a crossbow was pulled. No one could make the arrow that could kill disappear into thin air. The 8 generals that the second prince personally led numbered 6. They had all died to the Overwatch Council's attacks. Through different methods and different places, they disappeared into the darkness of Jingdo. From today onwards, the name of the 8 generals would become a stale name in history. Perhaps, it would not even be qualified to leave a mark in history. Yen Bingyun looked down at the piece of paper on the table, and subconsciously pinched the bridge of his nose to clear his mind. According to the plan, it was time to move on to the next step. As for the remaining 5 people to be killed, there were already specialized people to take care of them. The plan was linked to each other. Although it was the Overwatch Council's crazy revenge for the attack in the valley, Yen Bingyun still had to think of a way to control the situation to a certain extent. The second prince's 8 generals were not officials. They were just private generals in the manor. For people like this, as long as the Overwatch Council killed them cleanly and left no evidence, the court would not be able to do anything to Fan Xian. However, those 5 people were different. The officials to be captured next were also different. Although they were unremarkable figures in various departments, they were, after all, paid by the court. What kind of trouble would it cause to capture so many in one night? Yen Bingyun sighed. Through a secret mechanism, he notified his subordinates outside to come in and gave a second order. After giving the order, he habitually walked to the window and gazed into the distance at a corner of the palace wall not far away. He thought to himself that what the director had said was correct. Under the cover of Fan Xian's gentle appearance, there was indeed an element of madness hidden. Presently, only a dozen trusted aides had died in the valley, and Fan Xian had already gone crazy. If it was really as the director said and the day the director passed away, what kind of terrifying person would Fan Xian become? In Baoyue Brothel, Fan Xian's expression was very warm and calm. His eyebrows were slightly raised with an indescribable comfort. It was as if he had no idea what was happening in Jingdo at night outside the brothel. He had already finished talking about the attack in the valley. Regardless of whether the officials at the banquet had lingering fears or regrets, they all expressed their condolences to him. Immediately after, he briefly talked about the Jiangnan matter, the Ming family matter, and the palace treasury matter. He then furrowed his brows and said, "Actually, there is something I don't understand. When I was working for the court in Jiangnan, why did there always be people who liked to cause trouble in the capital?" Everyone at the banquet was slightly startled. They wondered to themselves what exactly he was talking about. During the year Fan Xian was far away in Jiangnan, it was impossible to say that there were no people in Jingdo who tripped him up. But, if you were talking about tripping him up, one a day for 365 days, which one were you talking about? Was it investigating the Ministry of Revenue? Or was it sending books into the palace? Furthermore, these trippings had long been torn apart by those old fellows. You are completely fine, so why are you here wailing? The crown prince couldn't resist laughing and scolding. Where did all these grievances come from? There are certainly people who are not on your side, but you can't name anyone who is purposely dragging you down. Fan Xian also smiled and shook his head. It's just that I haven't been back to Jingdo this year. I think perhaps many people in Jingdo have already forgotten what kind of personality I have. The second prince was holding a wine cup and carefully tasting it. Hearing these words, for some reason, a chill rose in his heart. Tonight, the crown prince's behavior was too strange, and Fan Xian's attitude was too arrogant. It was arrogant to the point that it did not make sense and did not conform to the rules. It did not benefit him at all. Was it because of the matter in the valley that he was in a hurry? The second prince's brows furrowed together nicely. He thought to himself, we still haven't found out who did it. What is the point of messing around with us here? At this moment, the Baoyue brothel suddenly became lively. Hearing the sound of horse hooves, it seemed that many people were heading this way. The crown prince, who was sitting at the head, furrowed his brows and said unhappily, "Who dares to make a ruckus here?" Everyone at the table furrowed their brows and looked out the window. It seemed that someone wanted to enter Baoyue brothel and had already successfully passed through the Jingdo garrison and Jingdo government bailiff's double line of defense. However, they were stopped outside the building by the people of Baoyue brothel. Fan Xian glanced at Sangwon. Sangwon understood and lifted the velvet curtain to flash past the side of the screen. In a moment, following a wave of hurried footsteps, Sangwon brought 5 people up the stairs. These 5 people were all wearing official robes, presumably officials of the imperial court. However, today was not a place to discuss important matters of the imperial court, but a place of pleasure. Everyone at the banquet recognized some of them as their trusted aides and couldn't help but be startled. They wondered what kind of game they were playing. Why would they come looking for them so openly? Could it be that something big had happened in the capital? The 5 officials met each other's eyes. They could all see the unease, fear, and panic in each other's hearts. Without caring about anything else, they first apologized to the nobles at the banquet and then glanced fearfully at Fan Xian. They bowed to Fan Xian and, without avoiding gossip, went to the banquet to find the person they were looking for and moved close to his ear to speak. Fan Xian smiled slightly as he watched this scene. He raised his wine cup and toasted Ran Xiaoan, who was beside the crown prince and the great prince. The great prince's imperial army system was clearly limited to the forbidden areas of the palace. His reaction was a bit slow. However, the crown prince seemed to have guessed something. Today, he had purposely cut off his own eyes and ears. He had only come to Baoyue brothel to get drunk. The great prince looked at the tense situation around him and furrowed his brows as he glanced at Fan Xian. It was as if he was questioning him. Fan Xian shook his head to indicate that he didn't know what had happened. On the other side, the expressions of the important figures who were listening to the reports from their subordinates gradually became unsightly, especially the second prince. His delicate and handsome face gradually became pale, and a trace of red quickly surged up, but after 3 breaths, it returned to normal. Fan Xian watched this scene with slanted eyes. He knew that the other party already knew the news of the death of the 8 generals. He had not thought that the second prince would be able to immediately control his state of mind. He couldn't help but feel slight admiration. The great prince furrowed his brows and asked, "What happened?" Everyone in the restaurant knew something had happened, but not everyone knew exactly what had happened. The second prince lowered his head slightly and raised his wine cup to take a shallow sip. Raising his head to look at Fan Xian, the smile in his eyes was slightly serious. Enunciating each word, he asked, Sir Fan Jr. must know. The atmosphere was icy cold. The people who had received the news from Jingdo all stared at Fan Xian's face. They already knew that while they were feasting in Baoyue brothel, a few murders had suddenly occurred in Jingdo. The 8 most capable generals of the second prince had been completely wiped out. These major figures had many eyes and ears in Jingdo. There were also the officials of the Bureau of Military Affairs responsible for the defense of the city. Of course, they knew how terrifying this kind of thing was, particularly to kill the 8 generals so cleanly and efficiently. The power needed was not something a normal person could possess. Thinking of how Fan Xian had invited everyone to Baoyue brothel, everyone faintly guessed that this matter was done by the Overwatch Council. Everyone was waiting for Fan Xian's reply. The atmosphere at the banquet was murderous and silent. Fan Xian asked warmly, "What is it?" The second prince smiled. There was some bitterness in his smile. There was a slight coldness in the depths of his heart. His legs were a little sore and numb. Looking at the young commissioner of the Overwatch Council across from him, it was as if he was looking at a smiling demon. As a prince, he didn't know what kind of reaction he should immediately make. Thus, he raised his cup and drank, emptying it in one gulp. There was a slight burning pain in his chest. After a moment of silence, the deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Chu Xiongdong, stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said in a cold voice, "Murders have occurred one after another tonight. 6 generals of the second prince's manor have been killed at the same time. Does Sir Fan Jr. know of this matter?" After these words were said, the great prince, who didn't know what had happened, looked at Fan Xian in astonishment. Even the crown prince, who had been in the arms of a beauty pretending to be confused, let out a surprised cry and abruptly sat up from the beauty's arms. The crown prince looked at Fan Xian's calm expression in a daze. He was incomparably shocked. He knew that Fan Xian did not have any good intentions today, but he truly had not thought that Fan Xian's counterattack would be so simple, direct, violent, unreasonable, and without fear of consequences. Under everyone's gaze, Fan Xian tilted his head. With a glimmer of confusion and disdain, he quietly said, "Oh, they're all dead?" At this moment, the second prince was about to put down his wine cup. Hearing Fan Xian's question, the emotions in his chest swayed. The anger, frustration, a glimmer of confusion, and a glimmer of hatred finally couldn't be controlled. When the cup fell, it was slightly heavy. The wine cup landed on the table with a bang and knocked the wine goblet beside it askew. From the expressions of everyone at the banquet, he knew that the 6 generals were all dead. Fan Xian's heart felt as if a sweet spring had flowed through it. He didn't purposely hide his expression. Smiling slightly, he said, "How can the second prince's family generals ask me? I've always heard that the second prince's family generals walk very arrogantly in Jingdo. Perhaps they have offended someone they can't afford to offend." This was the first time he had referred to himself as an official since the banquet began. As for who in Jingdo the 8 generals had offended but couldn't afford to offend, it was clear that person's surname was Fan. The banquet was silent. The second prince stared at Fan Xian's face in a daze and suddenly smiled. He knew that regardless of whether or not Fan Xian had done this, for the Overwatch Council to have the ability to completely wipe out his martial power in such a short time at the banquet, the Overwatch Council's power was not something he, a prince, could face head-on. He raised his cup to Fan Xian and said sincerely, "Commissioner, good methods, good courage." Fan Xian raised his cup in greeting and said comfortingly, "Your Highness, my condolences. The dead don't go, the living don't come. Metabolism is always like this." The deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs looked at the 2 seemingly similar princes in front of him. An absurd feeling involuntarily rose in the depths of his heart. Looking at it now, the second prince was far from being a match for Fan Xian. However, in terms of title, Fan Xian was, after all, an official. Where did he get such audacity from? Chu Xiongdong suddenly felt that he was old and timid, but he still couldn't resist opening his mouth to ask Fan Xian, "Sir Fan Jr., you should know about the Overwatch Council moving out everywhere tonight and capturing dozens of court officials, right?" Fan Xian carefully placed the wine cup back on the table with both hands. He raised his head and said, "I am the commissioner of the Overwatch Council and the head of the First Bureau. By imperial order, I oversee the governance of Jingdo. If I don't nod, who dares to capture those vermin?" I had wanted to continue describing the conversation and killing in detail, using the inside and outside of the building as a comparison. Hymns rang out, snowflakes fell. Were there any pigeons? Suddenly, I didn't want to write like that because it was too slow. This paragraph would take 60 to 70,000 words, so I changed it. I felt a bit helpless, but I was actually quite interested. There was another important point. Don't think of this matter as too exciting just because of the excitement of killing. In a hierarchical society, a society of slave masters and slaves, if it were to evolve into a war between slave masters, this bit of blood right now would not be enough. Someone nodded. Someone was doing something. Violence was killing people. Yes, the situation in Jingdo was like that. Fan Xian was actually like the old Qin master. He also liked to be simple, direct, and crude. He needed this kind of atmosphere. Although he was confident, he was not as perversely confident as the emperor. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 463. In this world, there were no officials who were not greedy. The only thing that mattered was whether one was greedy or greedy. The court was full of vermin, and the only thing that mattered was whether the vermin was fat or thin. If it wasn't so, why would there suddenly be a strange department called the Overwatch Council in the Qin court? Just as Fan Xian had discovered during the rectification in the first bureau, the Overwatch Council was also made up of people. Where there were people, there would be officialdom. It was impossible for the Overwatch Council to remain so cold and strict for the rest of its life. Furthermore, the Overwatch Council was not an immortal. It could not control anything above the third level. If the emperor did not issue an edict, it could not control military matters. Even if Chen Pingping and Fan Xian worked together, the Overwatch Council would not be able to change much of the current situation. In the end, the Overwatch Council was not investigating corrupt officials. It was only following the emperor's wishes to clean up the government from time to time, quell the people's anger, and make some space to maintain its rule. If it really wanted to investigate, how long would it take for the beauties in Chen Pingping's garden and the money Fan Xian had scooped up in the palace treasury to spit out? Let alone the emperor sitting in the royal palace. The emperor did not need to be greedy. He was the most greedy person in the world. If he was greedy for the entire world, what could the Overwatch Council do? It was precisely because everyone was greedy that when the Overwatch Council wanted to do something because of Fan Xian's madness, it seemed to come naturally and naturally. In this dark night, the entire first bureau of the Overwatch Council moved out and headed toward the mansions in the alleys and street corners. They captured countless lower-level officials who had close ties to the second prince and Xinjiang. Naturally, they could not touch anyone above the third level, but these lower-level officials were the ones the court truly needed to rely on. Everyone in Baoyue brothel already knew of the Overwatch Council's earlier actions. They had also received Fan Xian's personal confirmation. They couldn't help but show shocked expressions on their faces. The deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Chu Xiangdong, fell silent. He looked deeply at Fan Xian and didn't say anything more. Although the news tonight was not clear, it could be seen that the Overwatch Council's first target was still Xinjiang and the second prince's faction. They did not have deep connections with the military. Although he didn't understand why Fan Xian would suddenly use such a low-level method, the Overwatch Council's actions and Fan Xian's ruthlessness already made him feel a glimmer of fear. The beauty in the building was in his arms, killing and arresting people outside the building. Even if there was snow, how could it completely cover up the smell of blood? Not everyone sank into silence because of this sudden news. After the 5 reporting officials carefully retreated behind the screen, the great prince looked at Fan Xian with a heavy expression and asked, "Why?" The conflict between the Overwatch Council and the Xinjiang faction had been going on for a long time. It began 6 years ago with a dispute over the palace treasury. It was buried in the second prince's attempt to assassinate Fan Xian on Nyolan Street under the pretext of a banquet. It was also because of the story of that autumn in the Baoyue brothel where everyone was sitting. That autumn, Fan Xian took over the Baoyue house, killed Xie Bai An, and plotted against the capital government. He ruined the reputation of the second prince and Li Hongqing, the son of King Jing. He also made the Cui family in the north look like traitors. In the year after autumn, Fan Xian went to the Ming family in Jiangnan, collected the palace treasury, and killed Chong Kuan in Jiaozhou. In everyone's eyes, Fan Xian's revenge against the second prince and the Xinjiang faction was already severe enough, and he had reaped enough benefits. There was no reason for him to act so tyrannically again tonight. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then calmly said,
Why?
Because I am under orders to investigate the governance of officials. The banquet was silent. The crown prince sat high up and did not look at Fan Xian. Instead, he looked at the second prince's expression with a difficult-to-read expression. The great prince shook his head and sighed. There is no peace in Jingdo for more than 2 days. Why can't you all calm down a bit? Fan Xian knew the great prince was speaking from the bottom of his heart. This current commander of the imperial army had been on good terms with the second prince since childhood. Because of Lady Ning and Wanner, he was now standing on his side. Placed in this situation, it was difficult to avoid being in a difficult position. Hearing these words, he couldn't resist sighing. Peace? I haven't returned to the capital for a year. It looks like Jingdo has been peaceful for a whole year. Perhaps I am truly a star of misfortune. No wonder no one was willing to let me have peace in the valley outside Jingdo. The banquet was silent again. All the important figures faintly understood that this was Fan Xian finding a scene for the valley matter. However, this scene was a bit too big and absurd. There are many things in this world that are absurd. Fan Xian seemed to know what these important figures were thinking and said self-mockingly, just like the matter of me being assassinated in the valley. The court has been investigating, but because there is no evidence, they have never been able to come up with an explanation. He slowly said, "Who will pay attention to my subordinate?" As I said before, when my coachman was shot by the first arrow, I wanted to snatch him back into the carriage, but he stood up and blocked the arrow for me. I often ask myself, if I can't find any evidence, what can I do for him? The Jiangnan governor, Xueqi, glanced meaningfully at Fan Xian. The crown prince slowly said, "Naturally, the court will investigate." This was the 3rd time he had said these words tonight. Fan Xian nodded and smiled. It is this matter that suddenly made me think of a story I heard a long time ago. Once upon a time in the forest, there was a little white rabbit. It happily left the door early in the morning. Then it met a big bad wolf. The big bad wolf grabbed the little white rabbit and slapped it twice. Slap, slap, slap. I told you not to wear a hat. Everyone looked at each other. They didn't know why Fan Xian would suddenly tell such a childish story. They only heard Fan Xian continue. The next day, the little white rabbit put on a hat and went out again. As it walked, it met the big bad wolf again. The big bad wolf grabbed the little white rabbit again. Slap, slap. I told you to wear a hat. The little white rabbit was very depressed and ran to the tiger to complain about the big, bad wolf. The tiger listened to the little white rabbit's complaint and said painfully, "Don't worry, I will uphold justice for you." Then the tiger found the big, bad wolf and said, "Old wolf, this morning, the little white rabbit came to complain about you. It says you keep bullying it. See if you can find another reason to beat it. For example, you can say, 'Rabbit, go find me a piece of meat.' If it finds a fat one, you can say you want a thin one. If it finds a thin one, you can say you want a fat one. That way you can beat it again. Otherwise, you can have it help you find a female rabbit. If it finds a plump one, you can say you like a slim one. If it finds a slim one, you can say you like a plump one." Fan Xian told the story very seriously, but the words he used were childish and absurd. However, everyone at the table revealed thoughtful expressions, including the crown prince and Xueqi. They faintly understood who the tiger was referring to, but no one dared to show their expressions. Fan Xian drank a mouthful of wine and said seriously, after the old wolf heard this, he was very happy and repeatedly praised the tiger for being smart. However, their conversation was heard by the little white rabbit weeding outside the house. Very coincidental? However, stories cannot be written without coincidences. Continue. Fan Xian smiled coldly. On the 3rd day, the little white rabbit went out again and met the big, bad wolf again. The big, bad wolf said, "Rabbit, go find me a piece of meat." The little white rabbit said, "Do you want a fat one or a thin one?" The big, bad wolf furrowed his brows and smiled. In his heart, he thought, fortunately, there is a second move. "Never mind, I don't want meat. Go find me a female rabbit." The little white rabbit said, "Do you like a plump one or a slim one?" Fan Xian furrowed his brows tightly and shook his head. Meeting such a cunning rabbit, what do you think we should do? Everyone at the table also began to wonder what the big, bad wolf would do next. They couldn't help but be curious as to what Fan Xian would say next. Fan Xian pressed his slightly dry lips together and smiled. The big, bad wolf paused for a moment. He slapped the little white rabbit twice and scolded. I told you not to wear a hat. I told you not to wear a hat. The most unreasonable, shameless, senseless, and nonsensical reason in the world was the most adequate reason. In other words, there was no need for a reason. What mattered was whose fist was bigger. Fan Xian finally said seriously, I don't want to continue being a little white rabbit. I want to be a big, bad wolf. This was a joke he had heard in his previous life. Speaking of it tonight, it was heavy. Everyone at the table should have roared with laughter, but at this moment, no one laughed. Everyone sighed in their hearts. The matter of the attack on Fan Xian in the valley would probably never be investigated clearly. Tonight, the Overwatch Council assassinating the 8 generals, in a situation where there was no evidence and Fan Xian did not admit to it, would never be investigated clearly. The matters of the world were like this. Since they could not find sufficient reasons for their natural enmity, then what need was there to find reasons? The field of power was like a wild mountain, where wolves chased rabbits and tigers watched from the side. It was natural. Although the banquet was not broken, these major figures had long lost the will to continue. The officialdom of Jingdo had already been unable to calm down. Tonight, it was even more embarrassing. Although the Overwatch Council was using the night to act and presumably would not disturb too many Jingdo people, these major figures still rushed back to their manors and yamens to deal with the aftermath. At the same time, they were mentally and officially preparing to welcome the new situation. Fan Xian walked Xueqi to the door. Before Xueqi left, he turned his head and smiled warmly. Wolves are social animals. Don't turn yourself into a lone wolf. That is always dangerous. Fan Xian's heart warmed slightly. He bowed in thanks. Xueqi was silent for a moment. He then said, although the emperor has nodded his head, you still have to watch your limits, particularly the court's face. Fan Xian once again agreed. After the carriages of the few important figures slowly left the Baoyu brothel, the crown prince stretched lazily and walked down with the beauty in his arms. There were already servants by his side who draped the expensive fur coat over his body. The crown prince glanced at Fan Xian and smiled. Tonight's show was quite entertaining. The crown prince sent away the woman beside him and the idlers around them. Looking at Fan Xian calmly, he said, speaking of which, that autumn a year ago, when I saw the first half of the show you and second brother acted out, I also thought it was entertaining. Thinking about it carefully, there was nothing between you and me. Fan Xian froze slightly. He didn't know what this crown prince, who was acting very differently than usual, meant. There has never been a problem between you and me. The crown prince closed his eyes slightly and slowly said, if there is a problem, it is a problem from back then. It should not become a problem between you and me. I hope you remember this. Fan Xian understood that he and the crown prince had actually always maintained a kind of peace. However, because of the matter the empress had participated in, they had become natural enemies. He didn't understand what the crown prince was planning to do by saying this. However, Fan Xian believed that the crown prince would not watch as he killed his mother in order to fight for his support. Thus, he was just saying it. No one had left, but the seat was empty. Strangely, the second prince stayed behind. He watched Fan Xian walk up from downstairs and smiled slightly. Slowly placing his left hand on the table, he did his best to suppress the absurd feeling in the depths of his heart. Using 2 fingers, he picked up a green fruit from the south and slowly chewed on it. Fan Xian sat across from him and picked up the wine pot. He began to pour and drink by himself. Suddenly, he finished 10 cups. The great prince hugged the wine pot and drank heartily to the side. It was as if he wanted to get drunk. Fan Xian put down his wine cup and clapped his hands. The third prince obediently walked out from behind the curtain. He glanced at his big brother and second brother with some difficulty and then sat beside his teacher. The great prince glanced at Fan Xian disapprovingly. His eyes seemed to be saying, why drag me into the affairs of adults? In the flower hall on the 3rd floor of Baoyue brothel, there were 3 princes and Fan Xian. If one did not count the crown prince who had left earlier, the Qing emperor's bloodline in this world could be considered complete. The earlier banquet at Hongmen had become a family banquet with a strange atmosphere. You're afraid. The second prince put down the half-eaten green fruit and stared into Fan Xian's eyes as he spoke in a gentle voice. Fan Xian's hand holding the wine cup froze. He slowly replied, What am I afraid of? If you're not afraid, why did you make such a big move tonight? The second prince smiled slightly and gently said, only someone with fear in their heart would act recklessly like you did tonight. You killed my general and captured my trusted aide. Does that have any effect on the big picture? Fan Xian took a deep breath. His expression calmed. There are no outsiders here, so there is no harm in speaking frankly. Your subordinates have been cleaned out by me today, but you have no evidence. Just as I said earlier, I also have no evidence regarding the attack in the valley, but you still did it. I did not know about the attack in the valley. I did not participate. The second prince stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said seriously. Fan Xian shook his head. What about the Nyolan Street matter? Little White has been slapped in the face too many times. I admit that I still don't know who did it in the valley, but that doesn't stop me from taking action. He lowered his head and said, there were enemies on all sides. Since I didn't know which enemy did it, of course, I had to release random arrows. If I occasionally hit the person in question, it would be an advantage for me. If I hit someone else, I would not lose out. It would be an advantage. Nyolan Street. A glimmer of bitterness flashed through the smile on the second prince's thin lips. An incident from a few years ago. Thinking about it, it was just this one incident, yet you still remember it to this day. Fan Xian raised his head and calmly said, I am a very vengeful person. As you know, this matter has little to do with vengeance. As long as you don't stop, I will continue to do it without rest. There were no officials present or the crown prince present. Fan Xian and the second prince, a pair of young nobles with similar temperaments, spoke in a very direct and straightforward manner. They were both meticulous people and knew that there was no need for too many words to hide between them. The second prince glanced deeply at the third prince beside Fan Xian and suddenly said, sometimes, I feel that life is not fair. Putting aside the Chui family and the Ming family matters, just in this palace, my beloved sister has married you as your wife, and my two brothers, who have been friendly with me since childhood, are now standing on your side. The second prince raised his head. There was a glimmer of hidden anger on his handsome face. If my ability is not as good as yours, then so be it. However, this is only because of some absurd reasons and stories from a previous life that created the current situation. If Father was willing to give the Overwatch Council to me, would I do worse than you? If Father was willing to give the palace treasury to me, would I not have the ability to make the treasury more abundant? Neither you nor I know how to repair the dikes. You and I can only pay silver. Anji, don't you think this is very unfair? After all, I am the true prince. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He knew that his strange and varied life in the Qing kingdom and the abnormal power he was able to obtain now were all because of that woman's legacy. Of course, that woman had also brought him countless troubles and dangers. What the second prince said was not completely without reason. If he and Fan Xian had switched places, he might not have done better. It was not that the second prince did not have the ability. It was that he had never had the stage to display his ability. He slowly said, there is no such thing as if in this world. Correct. That is why you now have the Overwatch Council in your left hand and the palace treasury in your right, the second prince said with slight mockery. Presumably, only your mother once had such great power. So, you are now beginning to be afraid. Fan Xian's expression froze again. The second prince calmly said, have you thought about the future? Who exactly are you working hard for today? His gaze shifted slightly and glanced at the third prince. He smiled and said, none of the sons of the royal family are easy to deal with. You yourself are one of them. Of course, you understand this. The third prince lowered his head, not daring to interrupt. Fan Xian knew that the second prince was not speaking alarmist words. He just had his own plans and plans. The second prince faintly said, you are truly afraid. Think about it. Right now, you are walking down the path of a lonely official. Regardless of who ascends the throne in the future, how can the Qing kingdom tolerate you? How can the Overwatch Council be tolerated? Fan Xian listened calmly. The second prince continued, the reason you are afraid is because you are a smart person. You know that although your power is monstrous, it is only a floating cloud. It is not even as sturdy as a thin piece of paper. The second prince sighed. Because all the power in your hands was given to you by Father. With only one edict, You can be banished to the mortal world and never be able to rise again. Although father dotes on you, it is not as if he did not guard against you. These years, he has allowed you to do whatever you want, but he will not let you touch the military. I think I do not need to remind you of the deeper meaning behind this. In the end, the second prince concluded, it is because you are afraid that you want to reduce your own power. The great prince drank a mouthful of wine and looked coldly at his two brothers talking like two fighting cocks. Fan Xian was silent for a long time and did not respond to the second prince's words. He only quietly said, power has always been a floating cloud. When has there ever been an undefeated general or an undestroyed clan? Your Highness is a prince. Your heart is with the world, but I am only an official. I have to protect myself and the well-being of my clan. The second prince cut off his words and coldly said, I know that you, as a dignified immortal of poetry, have never been proud of the royal bloodline. On the contrary, you purposely avoided this point. Ask yourself honestly, if it were not for the royal bloodline that you loathe, how could you have lived until today and lived so gloriously? Two of the four brothers were silent. Two faced each other. Let go, the second prince said sincerely. The second prince said sincerely, your power is actually all illusory. You don't dare to kill me, so you can only watch as each day passes while you are in greater danger each day. Since you have already sensed this, why don't you just let go more completely? Given your reputation in the world, you are Wanner's husband, you are father's son, you are an honored guest of Northern Qi. Who would make things difficult for you? Who would dare to take unnecessary risks to make things difficult for you? Ling has said that you love to travel the world, so why are you still limited to this dangerous Jingdo and unable to free yourself? Fan Xian's brows gradually furrowed. His fingers slowly gripped the wine cup and said, Your Highness, I said earlier, my thoughts are the same as yours. He raised his head. His expression brightened. Looking at the second prince, he calmly said, A year ago in the tea shop outside this brothel, if you don't let go, I will beat you until you let go. Reality has proven that the present me has this power. You can no longer see the 8 generals in the tea shop. This is sufficient proof. Hearing the words tea shop, the second prince's expression immediately froze. He thought of the conversation he had with Fan Xian in the tea shop outside Baoyue brothel a year ago in the autumn. At that time, the conversation had taken place between a prince and an official. After a year had passed, Fan Xian's power had expanded like a balloon. Most importantly, the two people's true identities had gradually become the same. Why should I let go? The second prince asked somewhat nervously and self-mockingly. Your Highness has been poisoned by the eldest princess. I will help you cure it. Fan Xian did not retreat. Coldly he said, My words from before still stand. When your Highness maintains a distance from the eldest princess and truly lets go, I promise you, a lifetime of peace. Based on what? The second prince looked seriously into Fan Xian's eyes. Just based on the Overwatch Council and silver? Fan Xian shook his head and said, Not based on what? It is just that I owe the imperial concubine a favor and won her promise. Your Highness should know what happened tonight. I am going to empty your Highness's personal power and beat you out of this pool of rotten water. Once the second prince thought of the great loss he had suffered tonight, he finally could no longer suppress the chill in his heart. Sinisterly he said, Why me? I am not father's only son. You too. I don't have a glimmer of ambition. I am just an official, Fan Xian said. In another 2 days, your Highness will know my sincerity. As for the other princes, one is my student. I will beat him more obedient. The great prince likes to drink. I will ignore the crown prince, so I can only target you. You are right, this bloodline is worthy of some respect, so I will do everything I can to stop that terrifying thing from happening. The second prince's heart went cold. There was a gap in the screen that was not blocked properly. The winter wind began to drift slowly inside Baoyue brothel. Fan Xian finally said, Please remember this, Your Highness. The Emperor is in his prime and does not wish to see such a thing happen. When Fan Xian and the Emperor spoke in the palace, the Emperor nodded. Perhaps no one noticed, but the storm in Jingdo was a controllable wave. Fan Xian used the opportunity of the Emperor's nod to cause a stir and take advantage of it. If one said that being stupid was a kind of attitude toward life and pretending to be stupid was a kind of performance art, then being awesome was a kind of power that was backed by a mountain. Although Fan Xian's power was only a piece of paper, As long as the emperor was in his prime, this paper could cut throats. The spring and autumn of the banquet at Hongmen had finally covered the topic. Originally, I was going to talk about political correctness, friendship, and progress in history, but I could not write it out. The problem of ability. There was still a storm outside the Baoyu house. Fan Xian had written 4 strokes, and inside the house, there were 2. I had to write more carefully and try to write better. Today, this chapter seems to have added too many words. It is over 1,000. I am too lazy to fix it. Sorry, I will make it up tomorrow. If you want to know what happens next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. I support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 464. The second prince left Baoyue brothel. His expression was strangely cold. Regardless of what kind of information he had obtained in this conversation, and what kind of trust and fear he had toward Fan Xian's purpose, the reality of tonight had already proven a lot. His power in the capital had already been mercilessly uprooted by Fan Xian. There were only 2 paths in front of him. One was to firmly rely on the eldest princess's side. The other was to do as Fan Xian thought and obediently withdraw from the battle for succession. Without power, what could he use to fight? The second prince knew that if the situation continued to develop like this, if Fan Xian did not sweep through his power tonight, then in the near future, the Qing kingdom would either sink into turmoil or he would be mercilessly purged. He would not feel a glimmer of gratitude toward Fan Xian because Fan Xian had forced him onto a dead end. After the great prince spoke a few words with Fan Xian, he also left Baoyue brothel with a face full of worry. At the same time, he took the third prince with him. The conversation between the brothers in the royal family was not very pleasant. Since the third prince was returning to the palace, as the commander of the imperial army, it was appropriate for him to take him back. The night was gradually getting darker. If there were not thick snow clouds in the sky, one would certainly be able to see that the moon had moved to where it should be in the middle of the night. Fan Xian did not leave Baoyue brothel. He sat alone for a long time and had the brothel prepare a bowl of lamb slices in clear soup. He ate it until his entire body was hot. He drank a few more cups of wine before slowly standing and walking to the window to look down. Outside the window was a deathly silence. The people of the Jingdo government and the garrison had all left. Baoyue brothel was closed for the day. The girls had also gone to bed early. Only a few clever people were left to wait on him. Inside the brothel, red candles stood silently. Fan Xian had Si Qing prepare a bucket of hot water and took a comfortable bath. After the bath, he rubbed his slightly red face and asked, "Has the great prince gone to Yongsong Alley these 2 days?" Si Qing was listening from the side, and she knew that the big boss was talking about the Hu princess. She shook her head and prepared to help him put on his clothes, but he waved her away. Not long after, Sangwen came in. This gentle shopkeeper of the Baoyue brothel squatted down slightly and carefully put on his underwear. Her fingers slid across the surface of his well-proportioned muscles, and she couldn't help but be slightly startled. She didn't dare to move too much, and she carefully tied a hidden crossbow that was only 3 fingers wide to his left forearm. Putting on the boots and inserting the long and thin black crossbow head into the boots, Sangwen stood up and did the final tidying up of Fan Xian's clothing. She protected the black Overwatch council robe and covered Fan Xian's skin that could be damaged by every drop of rain. Only then did she nod. Fan Xian smiled to show his appreciation. After confirming that he had not lost the pills, he patted Sangwen's head and walked out of the room. Sangwen was slightly startled. "Sir, sword." Fan Xian turned his head and looked at the sword of the Wei Emperor in Sangwen's hand. His expression was calm, but a glimmer of confusion flashed through his eyes. A moment later he said, "This sword is too bright. It's best not to take it. Let's leave it here for now." The triple leather curtains of the Baoyue brothel were lifted open. All of the managers respectfully saw Fan Xian out the door. He had already lifted the hood from the back of his robe and put it on his head, letting the shadow cover his delicate features. Stepping down the stone steps outside the building, he couldn't resist raising his head to glance at the deep night. It was as if he wanted to confirm whether or not it would snow in a while. The carriage drove over. He shook his head, indicating that he was going to walk. He then headed east first. Baoyue brothel was having a banquet, so he did not bring the tiger guards. All of the Overwatch Council's power in Jingdo had already taken advantage of the night to carry out countless raids. Even the power of the Chinian unit had been thrown in. At this moment, there were only a few fan manor guards and a carriage driver at his side. Everyone knew about the Baoyue brothel's banquet and had heard about the commotion in Jingdo. They all thought that the young master was going to walk and think, so they didn't go forward to disturb him. They only had the carriage follow far behind. Not far after heading east, they turned and entered a straight street. Long street. Straight long street. Wearing a robe. He suddenly stopped his steps as if he was listening to something. He then waved his hand, indicating for the carriage behind him not to follow. He then walked toward the middle of the street. It was already deep into the night. A strange fog suddenly rose from the streets of Jingdo, which had stopped snowing. The fog was gradually heavier than the air. It gathered from all directions and gradually filled the long street. The slightly white fog was not very distinct on the lightless Jingdo night streets, but it effectively obstructed one's vision. It made one feel like they were blind and couldn't see their fingers in front of them. The carriage following behind did not dare let Fan Xian walk alone in the night. It was not prepared to listen to his arrangements, but it still had no choice but to stop. The fan manor guards in the carriage pulled out the infuriating lanterns a little brighter, but the dark yellow light only illuminated the fog in front. It was like the clouds above Tsong Mountain and could not see very far. They had long lost sight of the lonely figure in the black robe. On the long street, the white fog gradually thickened. Only the sound of Fan Xian's weak footsteps could be heard ringing out with a steady rhythm. Other than this, there was not a trace of sound. It was as if there were no living creatures on the street. Tonight, it seemed that the people the Overwatch Council wanted to kill had already been killed. The people they wanted to capture had already been captured and sent to prison, firmly under the 7th Bureau's control. The Jingdo people who still did not know about these things were greedy for warmth in their beds. The nobles on the night patrol had long returned home in fear. The night watchmen were slacking off, and the soldiers of the 13 city gate guards were only watching the city gates. The footsteps continued forward. They seemed to have sensed something and stopped in the white fog. A gust of winter wind blew past and thinned the fog on the long street slightly. One could faintly see the end of the long street. There shouldn't be anyone at the end of the long street, but it felt like someone was standing guard there. Wearing the robe, he stopped his steps and raised his head. His eyes calmly stared straight ahead. It was as if he wanted to see just who was there. Then, he saw a person. The person's figure was tall and sturdy. His shoulders were like metal. He stood there like a mountain at the end of the long street. On his back was a longbow and a quiver. There were 13 arrows in the quiver. The wind stopped and the fog thickened. It was no longer visible. Tonight was the moment Fan Xian had the Overwatch Council launch an all-out attack on the Second Prince's faction. However, he seemed to have forgotten one thing. When your attack was at its fiercest, it was often when your defense was at its weakest. At this moment, there was no one at his side he could rely on, only himself. He was taking revenge for the attack in the valley, taking revenge without reason. He had forgotten that a certain governor was also taking revenge for the death of his only son. Could he dodge the bow in front of him? 2 years ago, he had been shot down from the palace walls by this bow and had no power to retaliate. That bow and arrow had already become the biggest blank space in his martial cultivation. Thus, he stopped his steps behind the fog. On the other side of the white fog, Xueqi lowered his eyes slightly and felt the aura of the person behind the fog to ensure that he would not break free of his control. There were no signs of movement on this side of the fog. Xueqi, the previous commander of the Imperial Army and now the Qing Kingdom's northern governor, was one of the few 9th-level super aces in the Qing Kingdom. He was not a madman. He knew what it meant to assassinate Fan Xian on Jingdo's Long Street. However, he still did not forcefully suppress his desire for battle and bloodlust. When he saw Yan Shindu's body in the Yuantai camp, he had already made up his mind. What was the purpose of one's life? Even if he controlled all the soldiers under heaven in the future and conquered this entire land, who would he entrust it to? Thus, he was not a madman, but he was already crazy. Jingdo was not calm tonight. No one had thought that Fan Xian would carry out such a tyrannical sweep. At the same time, no one had thought that the governor of the north would abandon all his worries and return to his original hunter's thoughts. Coldly, he observed Fan Xian, watched Fan Xian, waited for Fan Xian, and patiently waited for Fan Xian until he was dead. Although there was fog on Long Street that could block people's vision, It could not stop Yan Xiaoyi's arrows. His arrows did not need eyes. Tonight, he had come with 13 arrows to ask Fan Xian what the words 13th Wang on the notice in the first bureau meant. If Fan Xian died, it was fine not to ask this question. Regardless of how much Fan Xian had improved these years or how much of a genius he was in martial cultivation, Yan Xiaoyi coldly believed that he could kill him. This matter had nothing to do with the fight for the throne or the world. It was not for justice or profit. It was just that a personal grudge could not be resolved. The two of them, one on the street and one in the middle of the street, other than facing each other head-on, there was nothing else they could do. Fan Xian was silent behind the fog. It was as if he was evaluating whether he should fight or retreat. After a long silence, Yan Xiaoyi took a step forward. The murderous aura around his body caused the white fog in front of him to move, revealing an empty space in front of him. The air immediately became cold again. However, he immediately pulled his foot back. Glancing at the eaves to the upper left out of the corner of his eye, he furrowed his brows slightly and used the stone beast on the eaves to block his body. With his body and the stone beast as a line, he felt that at the end of that line, there was a strangely terrifying killing intent waiting for him. This was an unreasonable feeling. He had grown up in the woods and interacted with wild beasts. He had developed a sensitivity like a wild beast. He would always be able to judge the existence of danger ahead of time. The longbow was already in his hand, but the arrow had not been nocked. Yan Xiaoyi lowered his head slightly and felt the strange movements around him. Just who was lying in ambush? He was a powerful warrior above the 9th level. Other than those 4 strange creatures, there was not much in this world that Yan Xiaoyi needed to be afraid of. Every time his condition reached its peak, the thought of challenging a great grandmaster would always rise in his heart. It was also because of his realm that he could clearly sense that there was only him and Fan Xian on Long Street. That was why he dared to use his mind to follow Fan Xian so coldly and prepare to fire a fatal arrow at any moment. However, when he had taken that step earlier, he had discovered a strange phenomenon. The first to bear the brunt was the unknown source of danger. The second was that when he had taken that step, he had felt the smell of the fog behind him change slightly. It was the smell, not the smell. It was the slightest change in the wind and fog, not the feeling after it entered his mouth. Yan Xiaoyi knew that there had always been a powerful figure hidden behind him. He didn't know exactly what realm this person's martial cultivation had reached, but to be able to fool him for so long, he must have the ability to hurt him. He didn't move rashly because he knew that once he fired the arrow, the energy he had stored up for a long time would leak out and reveal some flaws. Once his mind was flawed, he was not confident that he could escape unscathed under the combined attack of the ace behind him and the danger in the distance. Just like this, the long street was icy silent. The person on the other side of the fog could not move, and Yan Xiaoyi on the other side could not move either. He could not move his feet, but he could move his hands. Yan Xiaoyi sucked in a deep breath of air. His entire figure appeared to expand slightly. His fingers slowly fell as if inadvertently brushing across his bowstring. His fingers were very thick, but this movement was very gentle. It was like a soft brush sweeping across a drawing paper, a slender finger brushing across the strings of a zither, or an orchid blooming slightly. With a light hum, the bowstring began to tremble. There seemed to be a strange magic being generated on his bowstring. The slightly trembling bowstring moved the air around it, twisting the faint white fog and gradually condensing into power. It sliced through the long street in front of him. Following this light hum, it silently attacked toward the other end of the fog. It attacked toward the person on the other end of the fog. A muffled grunt came from the other end of the fog. Immediately after, there was the sound of someone falling to the ground. Yan Xiaoyi calmly flipped his wrist. The longbow straightened. He didn't seem to move at all, but the arrow was already on the bowstring. Earlier, when he shot without an arrow, he already had such power. Now, he already had an arrow on his bowstring. However, he didn't fire. He only remained silent because he could clearly tell that the person on the other end of the fog was not Fan Xian. Although he was confused, he had clearly seen Fan Xian leave Baoyue brothel. When did he switch? He understood that the roles of hunter and hunted had already changed in tonight's hunt. Yan Xiaoyi was stern and fearless. As long as the longbow was in his hand, even if 2 9th-level aces came to ambush him, he would not feel any fear. On the contrary, he felt an excitement he hadn't felt in a long time. At any moment, He was ready to use the arrow on his bowstring to end a certain life.
The arrow in his hand was not aimed, but his mind had already locked onto the distant place. However, the two sides were separated by the stone strange beast on the eaves of the residential buildings, so he was unable to fire. Xueqi still had a portion of his energy on the smell of the fog behind him that had changed for an instant and had now returned to normal. No one would move first. After an indeterminable amount of time, the strange fog on Chong Street still did not dissipate. Xueqi's mountain-like body continued to stand without a trace of exhaustion. However, he knew that the two people in the dock were also not tired. At least, they did not let him sense any relaxation in their state of mind. To be able to compete with him in patience and perseverance was a very impressive thing. Xueqi acknowledged the other party's realm and strength. He understood that the attack on Chong Street in the middle of the night had already sunk into a stalemate. He had used the stone beast to protect himself, but it had also blocked him. If this stalemate continued, the sky would probably brighten and the two sides would still not be able to move. However, the other party could retreat, but Xueqi could not move. He knew he had sunk into a disadvantage. Another long time passed. Xueqi was still standing steadily in the corner of the street, like an unshakable statue. The longbow in his hand, the arrow on the string, was steady and motionless, giving off a very strange sense of beauty. Suddenly, a coughing sound came from Chong Street shrouded in white fog. Accompanying this strange coughing sound, a faint light shone into the fog. The light gradually grew brighter. As it neared the corner of the street, as it got closer, it became clear that it was two lanterns. The lanterns were held by two young eunuchs. The young eunuchs' faces were pale from the cold. Behind the young eunuchs was a small sedan carried by 4 servants. The coughing sound came from that small sedan. The sedan stopped next to Xueqi. The curtain of the sedan was lifted slightly, revealing an old and tired face. This face belonged to Eunuch Hong. Eunuch Hong's murky eyes blinked. He said quietly to Xueqi, who was next to the sedan, admiring the snowy night on the street, "Governor is in a good mood. However, it is already late. You should return to the manor. I will send you off." To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support genuine reading. Chapter 465. The sedan chair slowly left Chong Street. The warrior with the longbow also disappeared with it. All that was left on the empty ground was snow and white fog. Following the departure of the sedan chair, the coughing gradually weakened. The fog on Chong Street gradually dispersed. Although it was still dark all around, it appeared much clearer than before. Snowflakes quietly fell from the sky, swaying gently and gently, as if there was a deity high up in the sky gently shaking a flowering tree. The clouds parted. A large crack suddenly appeared in the middle of the layers of dark clouds, revealing the crescent moon. The clear light gradually spread and illuminated this Chong Street clearly. The eaves of the stacked private residences behind the street that stretched into the middle of the street cast strange shadows on the ground because of the illumination of the moonlight. One of the black shadows suddenly trembled, twisting like some kind of living creature. Then, it slowly and silently retreated, shrinking back into the large mass of shadows, no longer able to be separated from it. Fan Xian lay on the corner of a building in the distance. He was wearing a snowy robe with white interspersed between black and white. He withdrew his gaze from the corner of the street blocked by the stone beasts and gently sighed, blowing out a white mist in the dark night. The threads of ice on his eyebrows cracked and shattered. Tiredly, he faced the sky and stretched out the aching muscles all over his body. His eyes stared in a daze at the crescent moon in the night sky above his head. Touching the hard chest beside him, he unconsciously shook his head and narrowed his eyes. He had put in a lot of effort tonight and had prepared sufficiently. It looked like he was about to succeed, but Eunuch Hong had broken the plan. It was truly a failure. He had not prepared to use the chest. After all, this thing was too sensitive. Until the last moment, he could not use it lightly. However, if he wanted to kill Xueqi, a warrior who already stood at the peak of humanity, he did not have much confidence without his palm touching the hard chest. This was the support of his confidence and the last thing he could rely on. Fan Xian lay in the remaining snow on the roof and took a few deep breaths, calming his emotions of failure and the anger that came from nowhere.
Someone crawled over. Fan Xian lifted the snowy robe and covered the object. A complicated emotion flashed through his eyes. Wang Qinian moved closer to his side and said, "It's Eunuch Hong." Fan Xian nodded. "Thank you for your hard work today." Tonight, everyone in the Overwatch Council was busy with bloody matters. Fan Xian's most trusted aide, Wang Qinian, appeared to have nothing to do. Only Fan Xian knew that the mission he had given him was for Wang Qinian to keep an eye on Yan Xiaoyi's movements. He knew that Yan Xiaoyi wouldn't miss this opportunity, so he didn't want to miss it either. Moreover, Wang Qinian's performance didn't disappoint him. An expert at level 9 didn't even notice that he was under Wang Qinian's watch. The two wings of the Overwatch Council, the most adept at tracking in the world, were indeed worthy of their reputation. Wang Qinian's face was very pale, even paler than the snow on the rooftop and the silver light in the street. Following Governor Yan was undoubtedly the most terrifying task in his life. That kind of fear and pressure made this 40-year-old middle-aged man almost unable to bear it, and his mind had long reached the point of collapse. And he didn't know if he saw something he shouldn't have. Fan Xian calmly said, "I trust you. More accurately speaking, many of my things are built on my trust in you." Wang Qinian understood what these words meant. Sir Fan Jr. had bumped into him when he first entered the capital. Then, with this as the center, he began to form the Qinian unit. Through the unit, he gradually controlled the Overwatch Council in his hands. Furthermore, he was, without question, the person in the world who knew the most of Sir Fan Jr.'s secrets, such as that night after reciting poems in front of the palace, that key. The next day, news came that there was an assassin in the palace. Wang Qinian knew who the assassin was. As for the key, it was certainly used to open something. Thus, Fan Xian still hadn't killed him to silence him. Wang Qinian was surprised and moved. He was truly moved. There was an urge in his heart to die for someone who understood him. This urge was clearly very dangerous and not worth it for him, who was over 40 years old, but he still kept this beautiful feeling in his heart. From below the gate came the cry of two owls. Fan Xian tilted his ear to listen. After confirming it was clean, he made a hand gesture to Wang Qinian beside him. A glimmer of fear flashed through Wang Qinian's eyes because he had also vaguely heard of that legend. He also knew of the connection between that legend and Sir Fan Jr.'s mother. He knew that from now on, his life was completely in Sir Fan Jr.'s hands. This was the trust between them. This kind of trust in itself was a terrifying and life-threatening thing. He flipped his palm and slid down from below the gate. His sliding posture was very strange and comical. He was like a large praying mantis with long arms and legs, but he was silent. In a moment, he had reached the ground and walked to the center of the street. He crouched down and checked the aura of the person in disguise. After confirming that he was still alive, he made a hand gesture toward the air. This hand gesture was for Fan Xian to see. Fan Xian looked at this scene and couldn't help smiling. Lao Wang indeed had some skill. With this qinggong, it was no wonder that the brocade guard hadn't been able to find anything to use against him after moving around in the north for a year. The person in disguise who had been injured by Yan Xiaoyi's flux will was the substitute Fan Xian had brought with him at all times when he had gone to northern Qi. Back then, this substitute had helped him greatly. Today, he took it out to lure the enemy. A few more strange bird cries rang out from below the gate. A few secret agents wearing black robes arrived with the Fan Manor's carriage. They picked up Wang Qinian and the substitute. All of this appeared peaceful and natural. At this moment, the clouds in the sky gathered again. The clear light disappeared. Jingdo sank back into darkness. Before dawn, when it was the darkest, snowflakes began to fall again. Fan Xian came alone to a shop in the west of the city. All of the residences were still asleep. The shops had not begun to make preparations. Even the noodle stall that had opened the earliest had not begun to prepare the minced meat. Only this shop had already opened. It used the alluring bean fragrance inside to disperse the darkness before dawn and wait for the arrival of the morning sun. Under the snowflakes, Fan Xian sat at a small table outside the shop. He held a bowl of tofu pudding in his hand and slowly drank it. The taste of the tofu pudding was not bad. There was not much bean flavor. The fragrance wafted through the nose. It was even better than what Donga made in Danzhou. This was a very natural reason. This tofu shop was the most famous in Jingdo. It was the first business the young master of Count Sinan's manor had set up after entering the capital. This tofu shop was Fan Xian's own. Fan Xian slowly drank the tofu pudding. His expression was calm, but he smiled bitterly in his heart. He had been reborn 20 years and truly was a useless second-generation ancestor. He had not brought much change to this world. The biggest change was probably the way he made tofu, right? His mother was too capable and too miraculous. In that short period of time, she had rushed to do everything that could be done. What was left for him to do?
Was he going to be like all those powerful officials in history, playing with power and enjoying riches and honor, not thinking about the lives and deaths of those below him and living a muddled life? Just as he had thought about it before, worry gradually appeared on Fan Xian's face. He always felt that there was a great desire in the depths of his heart, but he still could not grasp what that desire was. He was annoyed and depressed. Thinking of the incident on the street and the longbow on Yan Xiaoyi's back, his mood dropped. F***ck. Fan Xian used a very soft voice and a very gentle attitude to curse. The fog tonight was actually not good. Although this was the environment the shadow had long determined, he had not thought that Yan Xiaoyi's state of mind would be so powerful that he could not fear the layers of fog and accurately determine his position. Furthermore, the medicine hidden in the fog seemed to have no effect on this 9th-level ultimate ace. Once one's Xueqi had reached a certain depth, normal medicine was indeed not very useful. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. There was indeed no perfect thing in this world. The effect of the odorless white medicinal fog was indeed much weaker. Even so, in the murderous environment he had painstakingly created tonight, Fan Xian would still bravely try to kill Yan Xiaoyi. He was not the emperor. His confidence came from his own strength and luck that was better than anyone else's. He was not as inexplicable as the emperor. Thus, he was used to being the first to strike and eliminating all powerful figures that could threaten him. Yan Xiaoyi was the first person to bear the brunt. If there was great unrest in the Qing kingdom in the future, Fan Xian persisted. If he could weaken the other party's strength, it would be a wonderful thing for his side. Yan Xiaoyi was not in the military. Instead, he was in the capital. Furthermore, he was the first to strike. This was the best opportunity. If he allowed the other party to return to the camp on the northern expedition, it would be a pipe dream to try to kill him. Thus, Fan Xian sat at the table feeling very defeated and angry. Why had old eunuch Hong come out to break the situation? Fan Xian's right hand holding the bowl trembled slightly. He furrowed his brows and threw the bowl in his hand to the ground. The porcelain bowl shattered into countless pieces. It was rare for him to have such an uncontrollable display of anger. From this, it could be seen that old eunuch Hong's sudden appearance had indeed made him extremely angry. Why? His brows were furrowed deeply. He still couldn't understand this point. It was clear that old eunuch Hong coming out of the palace to break the situation was either the emperor's or the empress dowager's. But what exactly were the mother and son, the most powerful people in the Qing kingdom, thinking? Did they still not see the present situation clearly? If he could kill Yan Xiaoyi and had already cleaned out the second prince's power, the eldest princess's side would become increasingly weak. On the contrary, it would calm the situation of the entire royal family. Perhaps that terrifying ripple would gradually calm down. The emperor clearly knew this. Why did he nod his head and have eunuch Hong come out to stop his confrontation with Yan Xiaoyi? Could it be that the emperor was a madman who liked to see his sister step by step on the path of rebellion? A masochist? Fan Xian thought angrily. A bitter smile rose to the corners of his lips. It looked like the royal family was truly a nest of perverts. They all thought the world was too boring. But, was the emperor not afraid that he would be chased down from the throne? The repeated questions, the one that had troubled Fan Xian for a long time, made his expression become somewhat ugly. What exactly was the emperor thinking? Only the emperor himself knew what he was thinking. Chen Pingping also knew. Just as Chen Pingping had said in the past, a person would have the kind of vision they would have based on the kind of position they stood in and the judgments and choices they made in accordance with their position. Presently, Jingdo was still in a fermenting stage. Fan Xian wanted to take a risk and stop this process to prevent the dough from suddenly expanding in the future. Eunuch Hong's appearance today clearly indicated that the emperor did not need Fan Xian to worry about this. Thus, Fan Xian was very vexed. The first new plate of fresh tofu was brought out. It was still steaming. The worker in the tofu shop respectfully and cautiously scooped out 2 bowls. He put in white sugar, pickled mustard, sesame oil, chopped onions, and soy sauce.
The fragrant sweet and salty flavors were delivered to the small table and then retreated. The people in the tofu shop all knew of Sir Fan Jr.'s strange habit. This owner didn't throw away the tofu shop because it didn't make much money. He also never came in during the day to look. He would only come in every month or two at the darkest hour of the morning to order 2 bowls of tofu. Not many people knew of Fan Xian's hobby. Fan Xian was very tired tonight. He felt both mentally and physically exhausted. He used a porcelain spoon to randomly scoop up a bowl of tofu and sent a mouthful into his mouth. It was sweet and very tasty. Snowflakes also fell into the bowl, making him suddenly think of shaved ice, a long-forgotten term. He felt slightly better. He shaved a few mouthfuls and suddenly seemed to recover a great deal of his energy. There was another bowl that he didn't touch. The 3 carriages broke Jingdo's peace and slowly drove to the front of the tofu shop. The swordsmen in the front and back of the carriages jumped down and vigilantly watched the surroundings, setting up defenses. Yan Bingyun lifted the curtain and walked down from the carriage in the middle. After a busy night, it was clear that Fan Xian's brain was also very tired. There was a trace of haggardness on his pale face. He walked to Fan Xian's table and was clearly surprised that Fan Xian would be eating tofu here alone. Fan Xian nodded and indicated for him to sit. At the same time, he pushed the bowl of tofu mixed with chives and pickled vegetables over. Yan Bingyun didn't eat. He took out a file from his clothes and began to explain the situation tonight in a low voice. After hearing that the people he wanted to kill and the people he wanted to capture were basically in place, Fan Xian nodded his head with satisfaction. Huang Yi didn't die. Yan Bingyun glanced at him. Fan Xian raised his head and asked, "What happened?" The poison from the nails was very strong, but it seems that the Princess Manor has an expert at detoxification. Yan Bingyun said. So, Huang Yi was able to keep his life. Huang Yi was the strategist of the Princess Manor. Although he hadn't caused any harm to Fan Xian and hadn't displayed any extraordinary abilities, since Fan Xian had acted, he had to eliminate all potential threats. Thus, Huang Yi was also a part of the plan tonight. Fan Xian didn't want to, in the future, have a melodramatic scene of hostages being captured because of his moment of soft-heartedness. It's not an expert at detoxification. Fan Xian shook his head. I understand the methods of the brothers in the Third Bureau. The poison master in Dongyi is not of the same faction as us. It looks like the eldest princess infiltration into the Overwatch Council back then was very effective. Other than the dead Zhu Gu, she also prepared a number of detoxification pills. Yan Bingyun said, the spy buried in the Princess Manor hasn't been exposed. I acted on my own and had him withdraw. Very good. Fan Xian nodded his head approvingly. You make your own decisions on these matters. Don't let the people below take unnecessary risks. It's best if they can live. Although he said this, Fan Xian knew in his heart that this was the second failure of the night. Yan Bingyun opened his mouth again and said, the living witness you wanted to get a statement from is dead. Fan Xian raised his head and glanced at him. He knew he was talking about the only living witness in the Valley attack, the Qin family's private soldier. There had never been any clues or evidence in the Valley attack case. The only hope was that living witness. Furthermore, since he was locked in the Overwatch Council's celestial prison and had the protection of the 7th and 3rd Bureau, it was impossible for him to die like this. He forcefully suppressed the strange emotion in his heart and glanced at Yan Bingyun with a not quite there smile. Strangely, he didn't fly into a rage. Just now, Eunuch Hong came, Fan Xian said to Yan Bingyun. What do you think? Yan Bingyun was slightly startled. A moment later he quietly said, First, the master feels that you crossed the line tonight. Second, regardless of whether he or you die, the master doesn't want to see it. Don't talk about the master. I'll think of the old cripple's hateful tone, Fan Xian said with a furrowed brows. Yan Bingyun smiled and changed the subject. Although the emperor has given his nod, you took the opportunity to make such a big deal out of it tonight. In tomorrow's court conference, the council will certainly be attacked by a group of officials. I'm afraid that Xu the scholar and Hu the scholar will both speak. Under this kind of pressure, the emperor will have a certain attitude. You'd better be prepared. What are you afraid of? Fan Xian glanced at Sir Yan Jr.'s pale face and said self-mockingly, The emperor has long wanted to reduce the Overwatch Council's power. Didn't this give him a good opportunity? If I didn't know this, I wouldn't have rushed to attack everywhere tonight.
Before reducing power, I have to wipe out some of the enemies. With a clang, he threw the spoon into the slightly cold porcelain bowl. His face was like frost. Tonight, I didn't do a single thing I truly wanted to do. What a great loss. Yan Bingyun said, in a few hours, it will be the court conference. You have to go to court to report on your work. Prepare to be demoted by the emperor. Fan Xian closed his eyes and slowly said, a few days ago, the emperor had you young officials enter the palace.
His intentions were clear. However, how could those old people be willing to give up their positions? Tonight, the Overwatch Council conducted a large-scale investigation. Even if we will be punished afterward, some of those unclean people will have to step down. The court will have to make some space so that the emperor can place people in. We are working for the emperor, so he will have to owe us a favor. Yan Bingyun furrowed his brows slightly. It was still difficult for him to get used to Fan Xian calling the emperor like this. He was also displeased, so he could only maintain a suitable silence. Fan Xian couldn't be bothered to look at his expression. Minding his own business, he quietly said, tonight's matter is pretty much over. I just feel a bit regretful that the family I've been waiting for still hasn't made a move. Yan Bingyun knew which family he was talking about, but he pretended not to know. For a moment, his expression was hesitant. Shortly after, he smiled bitterly and said, do you think it's not lively enough? You don't have anyone by your side right now. You have to be careful of your safety. Fan Xian glanced at the Overwatch Council swordsmen scattered around and shook his head. I'm different from you. You have to bring these people. As for me, whether I bring them or not, it doesn't make much of a difference. If I brought people, how could those people dare to make a move? They're all a group of cowards who only know how to kill people in the dark, Fan Xian said mockingly. Fan Xian said mockingly, I've been sitting alone in this shop for an hour, but no one has come. It makes me look down on the so-called Iron Blood Army. Yan Bingyun shook his head and was speechless. Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at a small alley in the darkness. Using his finger to knock on the table beside the tofu bowl, he said, eat it. It doesn't taste good when it's cold. In a small alley some distance from Fan's tofu shop, there were 7 people dressed in black moving corpses onto carriages. Blood slowly dripped down from the carriages and landed on the snow, giving off a faint stench. The 3 corpses had been chopped into a dozen large pieces of meat. It was clearly the terrifying damage caused by a long knife. The leader of the 7 night walkers sat in the driver's seat. Glancing at the faint light of the tofu shop in the distance, he used the reins to rub the slightly itchy calluses between his thumb and forefinger. Opening his mouth into a smile, he said in a quiet voice, young master, eat slowly. To be continued. If you want to know what happened afterwards, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 466. Early in the morning, Fan Xian returned to his manor and changed his clothes. After giving a few orders, he sat in the carriage outside the royal palace. By the time he arrived, the area by the palace doors was already unusually lively. Officials were gathered in groups of 2 or 3 and whispering about something. He lifted the curtain to take a look and couldn't help but shake his head. It looked like last night's story had already become today's gossip. He was the center of the officials' discussion. He had not slept all night and had been tossed about so many things. It was inevitable that his spirit was fatigued. He accepted a towel soaked in ice water from Tang Zijing's hand and rubbed it hard on his face. The skin on his face hurt as if it had been pierced by needles. His spirit finally woke up a little. He yawned, stretched, and exhaled a few mouthfuls of murky air before getting out of the carriage. As he walked along the bricks of the square in front of the palace, he attracted countless gazes and discussions. Everyone was looking at the commissioner of the Overwatch Council dressed in official robes. This was Fan Xian's first court meeting since becoming the Jiangnan Road Imperial Envoy. Logically speaking, the officials in front of the palace should have come forward to exchange pleasantries and greetings. For some reason, the officials' eyes were filled with wariness. They only watched from a distance and did not come closer. In reality, the reason was simple. Last night, the Overwatch Council had killed and arrested people. Although the people they arrested were all low-ranking officials, there were too many people. No one knew how many court officials were involved. Although these officials were shocked, they were immediately surrounded by anger. In today's court meeting, they were certain to report Fan Xian. Since it was so, it was not good for them to come forward and greet him. Fan Xian left in a bad mood.
He felt that he was about to become a lonely official who was spurned by the civil and military officials of the court.
Although this was his own doing, this feeling of being ignored was like being boycotted by little girls in kindergarten. He was filled with grievance. His face did not show it.
He continued to smile calmly and warmly as if he did not feel the fiery gazes.
When he walked to the palace doors, the guards and eunuchs guarding the doors greeted him.
Fan Xian looked at the two eunuchs' ingratiating gazes and felt his heart warm and comforted.
He thought to himself that in this world, it was indeed the handicapped who were more caring.
Tilting his head, he saw that the two leaders of the civil officials were pointing their noses at the sky, as if they were observing the sky to see if there was anything unusual.
Fan Xian rubbed his nose. He was familiar with the white-bearded old man on the left.
He also knew that the middle-aged man on the right was certainly the initiator of the literary reform movement, Hu the scholar.
Seeing these two overseers of the Hall of Governmental Affairs treat him so coldly, Fan Xian knew that he had made too much of a ruckus last night.
In the eyes of these people, he was already leaning toward becoming a powerful and treacherous official.
Additionally, the Overwatch Council's abnormal actions had indeed created a bad influence on court politics. These two leaders of the civil officials would not be too close to him, the head of the Secret Service.
But he didn't buy it. Forcefully suppressing the resentment in his heart, he moved closer with a mischievous smile on his face and stood next to the scholars Xu and Hu.
He didn't say anything and instead raised his head to look at the sky in a strange manner. For a moment, the officials waiting to go into court saw a strange sight. The two scholars, as well as the wretched commissioner of the Overwatch Council, all had their necks straight and heads tilted up. They looked endlessly at the layers of black clouds in the sky but did not say anything. They were only silent. After looking for an indeterminable amount of time, it was finally the easygoing Xu the scholar who couldn't bear it anymore.
With a cold huff he said, "What is Sir Fan Jr. looking at?"
Hu the scholar also pulled back his gaze from the sky. Although the two scholars were clever people, they were not as thick-skinned as Fan Xian. They could not endure too many people's strange gazes. He coughed and didn't say anything. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Whatever you two are looking at, I am looking at." Xu Wu furrowed his brows and looked at him, wanting to say something but then hesitating. After enduring for a moment, he still couldn't hold back the anger in his heart. He opened his mouth to reprimand. "Do you know that because the Overwatch Council has power, it has to act carefully and safely? Putting aside what your intentions are, just driving around Jingdo like a tiger or a wolf, how will the officials behave? How will the court act? You don't want the face of the world's gentry, but the court wants it. Tell me. You've captured so many yamen of the 6 ministries. How will they act? Putting aside how to act, the officials' hearts are all cold. How foolish. How foolish." It was fine if he didn't say it, but once he did, he couldn't stop. On the contrary, it was Hu the scholar who gave Xu Wu a meaningful glance. Only then did Xu Wu stop. However, he still felt bitter and hateful. He couldn't control his anger. Presently, Fan Xian was no longer just a teacher in the Imperial College. He was also no longer an empty prince consort who could only roll around in Honglu Temple. Although the rank of the commissioner of the Overwatch Council was not high, he was, after all, an imperial envoy. Although Xu the scholar was now the head of the civil officials, it was still inexcusable for him to scold an imperial envoy so haughtily. "Stop scolding," Fan Xian said with a smile. Fan Xian laughed and said, "No matter what, you are still an elder. To be so fierce to my nephew, it does not look good to the officials below." Xu Wu was furious, but he couldn't scold Fan Xian's tired but respectful face. He huffed hatefully and swept his sleeve. "In the court conference today, just wait for me to report you." Fan Xian's face was bitter. He raised his hands in greeting and said, "As expected. Elder, please take care of me." Xu Wu was angry, and also wanted to laugh. Coincidentally, the palace doors opened. With the crack of a whip, ceremonial music began to play. He and Hu the scholar walked in first. It was a court conference. There were many more officials in court than usual. Even so, given Fan Xian's official rank, it was still not enough for him to line up in court. However,
He now had the identity of Zhongnan Road Imperial Envoy and was going to the palace to report on his work, so he did not need the emperor's special edict.
However, entering the palace also needed to be lined up, so Fan Xian could only be at the back. As he stood at the palace gate, a cold and sinister aura seeped out, making the officials who walked past him feel a chill. Earlier, when there were a lot of people, they could still tie together and ignore Fan Xian. Now, they were walking into the palace in pairs. The officials estimated that their status was far from Xu the scholars. They calculated the emperor's favor Fan Xian carried and thought of Fan Xian's methods. They had no other choice. They could only quietly greet him each time they passed him. Toward Sir Fan Jr., whom they had not seen in a year, these officials did not dare to be too disrespectful.
Sir Fan Jr., I trust you have been well?
Greetings, Commissioner Fan. Fan Xian smiled and responded to each of them.
Although he knew that he would lose face because of these people in the court conference, the vanity of being bowed in order by the officials at the palace doors was not bad.
He had to make the best use of this time to gain some benefits in terms of face.
He had gained the benefits in terms of face, but what he got in the palace was only sour fruit. Fan Xian stood at the very back of the line and secretly sized up the emperor on the dragon chair with a slanted glance. A wave of tiredness surged through him. Looking at the emperor's calm and spirited expression, he felt a bellyful of anger. He thought to himself, "You sleep peacefully, but I'm about to die of exhaustion from doing things for you." Just as everyone had expected, once the court conference began, before everything had been properly arranged and the governors of the 3 roads standing below Xu and who the scholars had time to present memorials, the battle of memorials targeting Fan Xian and the Overwatch Council's actions last night suddenly began. Fan Xian did not listen to the specific contents of the memorials. It was nothing more than the old words Xu Wu had once said. The Overwatch Council did indeed have the duty of supervising the governance of officials, but it had been many years since an action like his, where he had captured over 30 officials in one night, had taken place. It could truly be said to have shaken the court. He looked at the governors of the 3 roads and was not surprised to see Xueqi at the top. The Qing kingdom's territory was large, and there were 4 governors in remote areas who returned to the capital every 2 years. He wondered with some curiosity. Last night, Xueqi had been watching by imperial edict in Baoyue brothel. Logically speaking, he should have entered the palace that night to report to the emperor. He wondered what the emperor thought of him.
Fan Xian was truly tired, so his mind wandered completely.
However, there were many things he could not hear even if he did not want to hear. The attacking words of the entire court continued to surge endlessly into his ears. Gradually, the crimes began to grow, such as looking down on the court, disrespecting morals, using national weapons for private purposes, forming a clique, and so on. In the Qing court, the Overwatch Council and the system of civil officials had always been sworn enemies. Regardless of what faction the civil officials had, when faced with the Overwatch Council, they were always united. From when Prime Minister Lin was there to now when the scholars were at the head, as long as the Overwatch Council, the Emperor's secret organization, overstepped its bounds, the system of civil officials would band together and carry out the most powerful counterattack.
Without question, Fan Xian had overstepped his bounds last night. Thus, today's court conference became the battlefield where he was attacked. What was different from previous years was that the military, which had always had a close relationship with the Overwatch Council, no longer maintained its silence. On the contrary, the 2 deputies of the Bureau of Military Affairs also stood out and secretly expressed their dissatisfaction with the Overwatch Council's actions. Even the emperor himself probably did not want to endure this kind of pressure, much less Fan Xian, who stood alone at the end of the line. The atmosphere in Taiji Palace was no longer oppressive. On the contrary, it was filled with a kind of irritation unique to winter. With Xu Wu in the lead, the officials all went up to ask the emperor to restrain the Overwatch Council and at the same time make a final judgment on this matter. One after another, their words pierced straight into Fan Xian's heart and wounded his spirit. Slanderous water flew in all directions. If it had been any other official in Fan Xian's position, they would probably have long lost their minds in anger and jumped out to debate with the officials. At the same time, they would gather their remaining courage and pull out the beards of the imperial censoriate's imperial censors. However, Fan Xian still forcefully maintained his calm. He didn't say a word or defend himself. He only tilted the corners of his lips slightly, carrying a glimmer of a mocking smile as he watched the stage of the court conference. Perhaps it was the smile at the corners of his lips that made someone uncomfortable to look at. It made someone feel that his son was too impetuous and arrogant. An angry rebuke came from the dragon chair. Fan Xian, do you have nothing to say? Fan Xian had been forcefully pushing away his drowsiness. Suddenly hearing these words, he shivered. Tidying his official robes, he stepped out and bowed. Your Majesty, last night, the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council summoned 32 officials for questioning. Everything was done according to Qing law and edict. There was nothing that went beyond the rules. Thus, I do not understand why everyone is so agitated. The Emperor smiled coldly and said, You captured 32 people in one night. You sure are arrogant. Is the Qing court full of corrupt officials? Fan Xian said seriously, I dare not deceive your Majesty. In court. He gazed at the officials in the palace and said seriously, Vermin crawl all over the ground. 32 people is only a small number. If your Majesty grants the Overwatch Council a special edict, I will certainly be able to capture more corrupt officials. The officials' hearts chilled. Immediately, disdain rose to their faces. They thought to themselves, what are you talking about? What is the court? The court is the officials. There are no officials in this world who are not corrupt. If you capture them all, who will govern the world on behalf of the emperor and protect the people? How could the emperor give you a special edict? As expected, the emperor flew into a rage and gave Fan Xian a thorough scolding. It was nothing more than not seeing the big picture, acting recklessly, and sullying the emperor's heart. Fan Xian was unhappy. Although he knew it was an act, he was still unhappy. He resentfully returned to the ranks. In the court conference, no one brought up the death of the second prince's 8 family generals, the death of Governor Yan's only son, and the eldest princess strategist Huang Yi being poisoned and vomiting blood in bed. Those people were not officials. Furthermore, it was a matter of the dark. No one would be so stupid. However, just the events of last night were enough to arouse the wariness and anger of the civil and military officials. Thus, even the emperor had to appease them. However, the emperor sitting on the dragon chair only coldly said, Concerning the assassination attempt on Fan Xian in the outskirts of the capital, how is the investigation going? The officials were silent. The official of the Supreme Court and the Minister of Justice stepped out with trembling bodies and repeatedly begged for forgiveness. Fan Xian had no choice but to step out and beg for forgiveness. After all, the Overwatch Council was part of the Joint Investigation Division. However, this matter was absurd. He had been assassinated, but he had not found out, yet he had to beg for forgiveness. The emperor looked at Fan Xian and furrowed his brows. I heard that the last witness died in the celestial prison last night. Is this true? Fan Xian was stunned. He had not thought that the emperor's news would come so quickly. On the other side, the faces of the Wu officials revealed a deeply hidden joy and smile. They were waiting to see how Fan Xian would explain this matter. The emperor did not need too much explanation. All of the preparation work had already been done. The emperor was decisive. He issued the edict he had been preparing for a few days. The first part of the edict made all the civil and military officials feel a sense of disbelief because the emperor had reduced the power of the Overwatch Council. The Overwatch Council's rank did not drop, but its power was greatly restricted, particularly the first bureau stationed in Jingdo. Although it still had the power to arrest people, it had made detailed rules on the time limit after an arrest. In particular, the transfer of prisoners to and from the Supreme Court had to be completed within 48 hours. In other words, the First Bureau no longer had the power to secretly interrogate officials in the capital. At the same time, the edict made a general limit on the power of the Fourth Bureau stationed in each province. As for the specific rules, Fan Xian would have to return to the council to draw up a draft and then submit it to the court for discussion. These 2 changes appeared small, but in reality, it was like a timer had been placed on the Overwatch Council. It made it inconvenient for them to do things in the future. Fan Xian listened to the edict. He felt disgusted like he had eaten a fly, but he still had to step out and give thanks. The civil and military officials were pleasantly surprised. At most, they had wanted the emperor to issue an edict to demote Fan Xian and, at the same time, slightly restrain the Overwatch Council and give the subordinates who had been innocently arrested a chance to live. They had not expected that the emperor would actually take action against the Overwatch Council. If this trend continued, the Overwatch Council's power would gradually be whittled away. Thus, cries of "Long live the Emperor" filled Taiji Palace. The officials secretly thought that the emperor was indeed wise.
However, the second part of the emperor's edict made the civil and military officials feel that although the emperor was wise, he was still too protective of his own people. The edict made it clear that the officials who had been arrested last night were not limited by the previous rules. They would all be handed over to the Overwatch Council to interrogate, and then handed over to the Supreme Court to convict and interrogate. At the same time, the emperor used this matter to fly into a rage. He angrily rebuked the officials in the palace for not being strict with their subordinates and letting down the grace of the country. They only knew how to form cliques for personal gain and were shameless. Once the edict came down, the officials were terrified and didn't know what to do. Because the investigation of the attack in the valley was not done well, the Jingdo guards were treated as empty, and the case of corruption among the officials in the capital, the right deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Xueqi, was demoted. The commander of the Jingdo garrison, Qin Hang, was removed and replaced by the deputy general of the Western Expedition Army. Qin Hang was transferred into the Bureau of Military Affairs. At the same time, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Justice was replaced, the deputy of the Supreme Court was replaced, and the imperial censor writing in the imperial censor was replaced. The replacements were all the young officials who had entered the palace a few days ago. The officials paled in shock. The emperor's lightning-fast methods truly caught everyone off guard. If it weren't for the recent conflicts in Jingdo, such a large-scale change of blood would not have proceeded so smoothly. Everyone knew that the matter was not over yet. They couldn't resist sneaking a glance at the young man at the back of the line. A complicated emotion welled up in their hearts. Only now did they understand that Sir Fan Jr.'s sinister actions last night were just foreshadowing the edict in today's court conference. It has been very busy recently. The timing of the updates has been a bit unstable. I will report to everyone in the future. I wish everyone a happy weekend. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 467. Once the edict came down, the officials were in an uproar. Although the leaders of the various departments had not changed positions, there were more young officials at their side. They couldn't help but feel a glimmer of fear. Who knew when the emperor would raise up those young officials to replace them? These old people. Shu the scholar furrowed his brows and stepped out. He argued with the emperor for a bit. He felt that such a large-scale appointment of officials without going through court deliberations or having the Ministry of Appointments and Overwatch Council examine it first was truly too rushed. However, the emperor had made up his mind and did not even give him face. He lightly refuted it. This imperial edict became a matter that was set in stone. A change of blood was already inevitable. Qin Hang had been moved to the Bureau of Military Affairs. His rank appeared to have increased, but in reality, he had left the vital area of the Jingdo garrison. He was somewhat stunned, but he could only step out and thank the emperor. Other important figures like the previous deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Chu Xiangdong, could only helplessly accept this suggestion. The emperor did not look deeply into the matter of the attack in the valley. Otherwise, the military would certainly have to pay a greater price. However, the gazes with which the military generals looked at Fan Xian became increasingly angry. Everyone knew that among the civil and military factions, the emperor had adjusted the Bureau of Military Affairs and the Jingdo garrison to support Fan Xian and vent his anger for the attack in the valley. As for what other follow-up actions there would be after the court was dismissed, they would have to wait quietly. However, the military's days were not going to be easy. Among the civil officials, the largest number of officials had been replaced. Basically, they were all officials close to the second prince's faction. What was particularly terrifying was that it seemed that the 32 officials Fan Xian had captured last night would not have a chance to come out again. Fan Xian listened carefully to the edict. It was clear that the emperor had prepared this edict last night. After listening for a long time, he was surprised that he did not hear Yan Bingyun's name. However, thinking about it, it made sense. Even if the emperor wanted to put Yan Bingyun in an important position, he would not move him to another department. Putting aside the fact that this was against Qing law and the Overwatch Council's rules, if the emperor wanted to use Yan Bingyun, he would have to give Chen Pingping some face. As for Sir Yan Jr. being promoted, it was also impossible. If he was promoted again, he could only take Fan Xian's commissioner position. Fan Xian shook his head and thought to himself that unless the emperor was prepared to single-handedly flip the Overwatch Council over, he would not do such a thing.
But Fan Xian was surprised to hear Cheng Jialin's name.
He tilted his head slightly and resisted the urge to look at the middle-aged man on the dragon chair. A strange feeling welled up in his heart.
Jia Lin was his student and was now an official far away in a foreign land. How had he fallen into the emperor's eyes? And to the Ministry of Personnel? The department that he had been unable to interfere with had been promoted twice in one go. This kind of promotion speed was too fast. When the officials of the court heard Cheng Jialin's name, they couldn't help but be shocked. Everyone knew that he was one of Fan Xian's 4 disciples. He had only been an official for 2 years. Why was he being transferred back to Jingdo? Everyone turned their gazes toward Fan Xian, their gazes filled with caution and fear. Fan Xian felt a bit uncomfortable.
The favor the emperor had given him was too great.
According to his habits, after giving a sweet date, there would be a stick. He didn't know where the stick would land. Shan Chongwen has been transferred to the Imperial Censorate to be an Imperial Censor. He has ordered the Imperial Censor of the Left, He Zongwei, to oversee Overwatch Council matters and assist Fan Xian in his actions. He is responsible to the internal court. The stick came really fast. Fan Xian abruptly raised his head.
A dim light flashed through his eyes as he glanced at the young man who had stepped out to give thanks. The Imperial Censor of the Left had entered the manor? Although the Overwatch Council had always been under the supervision of the internal court in name, the Qing royal family had always strictly prohibited eunuchs from holding power. Additionally, Chen Pingping was too powerful, so the Overwatch Council was like an independent kingdom. To have the Imperial Censor of the Left keep an eye on the Overwatch Council and report to the internal court at the same time was putting the Overwatch Council directly under the gaze of the royal palace.
Fan Xian's back felt a chill. The fingers on his right hand trembled slightly. He knew that because of his identity, the emperor would not trust him as much as he trusted Chen Pingping.
However, he had not thought that the emperor would act so ruthlessly.
Before the matter had even concluded, he had already put a rope around his head and pricked it until it hurt. Who was He Zongwei? He was a Jingdo talent who had once been as famous as his student, Ho Jichong. He was one of his sister Ruoruo's pursuers. He had first been under the crown prince and then the eldest princess. Now, he had become the emperor's student. Without going through the imperial examinations, he was directly selected into the court as an imperial censor.
Because of his meritorious service, he had become the Imperial Censor of the Left and was responsible for investigating the Ministry of Revenue case.
Not including Fan Xian, He Zongwei was definitely the most popular figure in the Qing court these 2 years. Yet, such a disgusting person like Fan Xian was going to become the emperor's eyes watching the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian grew angry for no reason. He was unusually angry. Your Majesty! Fan Xian stepped out of the ranks and stood by He Zongwei's side.
Facing the man on the dragon chair, he said in a low voice, "I have an objection."
He Zongwei glanced warmly at Fan Xian beside him.
Although each time he thought of being beaten by the other party in Fan Manor, he felt an incomparable anger in the depths of his heart. He still hid it well. His eyes revealed just the right amount of strangeness and admiration. It was as if he was expressing his emotions to the officials in the palace. He admired Sir Fan Jr. for daring to talk back to the emperor. The palace was already in an uproar. The emperor had an order, and the officials had to accept it. Other than old people like Xu Wu, who dared to talk back to the emperor, no one had ever directly expressed their objection and resentment on the appointment of an official. The emperor furrowed his brows and said, "What objection do you have?" Fan Xian raised his head and said expressionlessly, "The Overwatch Council does not need an imperial censor to point fingers." "How dare you?" The emperor slapped the dragon chair and said angrily, "The law enforcement is at the side, and the imperial censor is at the back. The laws of the country are clear. My decision has been made. How can I allow you to speak so much?" Anger rose in Fan Xian's heart. He knew he could not retreat anymore. Otherwise, if the Overwatch Council really fell at his hands, how would he explain it to that woman and the old cripple in Chen Garden? He straightened his body and straightforwardly said, "May I ask, Your Majesty, the Overwatch Council is responsible for supervising the governance of officials? It is overseen by the internal court, the Overwatch Council. Suddenly, there is an imperial censor.
If this imperial censor is corrupt and breaks the law, should the council investigate or not? If we are to investigate, how? The officials clamored.
On the contrary, the emperor laughed coldly and said, "You have been clever your whole life, yet you are pretending to be confused.
Go back." At Fan Xian's side, He Zhongwei also insincerely tried to persuade him, but Fan Xian couldn't even be bothered to look him in the eye. He also didn't retreat.
His eyes spun a few times and suddenly said in a loud voice, "I object."
This was a bit over the line. When the emperor decided on something, how could he, an official, object? This was not a lawsuit in court. Fan Xian, you are not Song Shuren, and the emperor is not a little prefectural magistrate. The emperor's anger was not kind. The beard on his chin trembled wildly. Pointing down at Fan Xian's nose, he scolded, "I want to see how you object." Fan Xian steeled his heart and said, "Naturally, I do not dare to object. However, I am only the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. The director is still in Chen Garden. Logically speaking, it is not my place to discuss this edict. However, I am the head of the Overwatch Council today. Whether I accept it or not, it is also a problem. It looks like I can only resign as commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Your Majesty, directly send an edict to the Overwatch Council. Resign as commissioner of the Overwatch Council? Resign?" The officials were in an uproar. They had no idea how the court conference had developed into such a situation. They had thought that the emperor was using the Overwatch Council to clean up the court. How come, in the end, he was bullying Sir Fan Jr.? However, Sir Fan Jr. was indeed worthy of being an immortal poet. The pride in his bones was indeed not something normal people could compare to. He dared to use resignation as a threat in the court conference to not accept the edict. Since the founding of the Qing Kingdom, these officials had never seen such daring. For a moment, the sound of discussion rose in the palace.
Other than the initial fear in their gazes toward Fan Xian, who was standing in the center, they couldn't help but have a glimmer of absurdity and admiration.
Xu the scholar and Hu the scholar could not continue watching. They both stepped out, one playing the bad cop and the other playing the good cop. Xu the scholar scolded Fan Xian, saying that he did not know his duty as an official and spoke nonsense. Hu the scholar stood by Fan Xian's side and comforted him, explaining the emperor's edict in detail. In any case, Fan Xian just stood straight and refused to accept the edict. He also refused to do anything. This scene looked like a kindergarten student who had lost fruit on his lunch plate and was being tricked by two teachers. Xu and Hu the scholars then turned to beg for forgiveness on Fan Xian's behalf, saying how Sir Fan Jr. was young and so on.
They guessed that it was rare for the emperor to encounter such a big nail in court.
He was probably about to go crazy with anger. On the dragon chair, the emperor laughed angrily. A cold light shone in his eyes. Coldly he said, "Fan Xian, are you going to use resignation to threaten me?" "I don't dare." "Good, good, good." The emperor said, "Good," 3 times in a row. Faintly he said, "You think I won't punish you just because I love you? If you want to resign, then I—" The emperor had not finished speaking when Fan Xian was moved and thanked him. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I am willing to go back to the Imperial College to teach." The emperor choked on his quick response and said angrily, "I will not let you resign." For a moment, the palace sank into a shocked silence. No one had thought that they would be able to see such an exciting show at the court conference. Everyone knew that the emperor's favor toward Fan Xian had not decreased at all. He probably would not give Fan Xian any substantial punishment. However, they didn't know how this stalemate could be broken. The officials did not understand why Fan Xian would be so angry and impulsive toward the Imperial Censorate asking about the Overwatch Council. If it was to maintain the Overwatch Council's power, given Fan Xian's methods, he had plenty of ways to do so in the future. Furthermore, the Overwatch Council still had an ancestor that had not made an appearance. It was clear that the emperor also did not know what Fan Xian was thinking. He furrowed his brows and said to Fan Xian, "Get over here." Fan Xian did not get out. He ran over with a jolt and moved closer to the dragon chair. His face was full of stubbornness and ruthlessness. The emperor lowered his voice and asked, "Are you going to accept the edict or not?" "No." The emperor furrowed his brows and said, "Why?" Fan Xian said straightforwardly, "I don't like He Zhongwei." The emperor angrily said, "Last night, you already made the court lose face. Do you want me to lose face again today? Get back here. Fan Xian sighed and retreated.
Eunuch Yao stood to the side with a pained expression. Holding his horsetail whisk, he suppressed a smile.
It was very uncomfortable. Fan Xian retreated into the palace. The officials on both sides looked at him with strange gazes.
He was actually whispering to the emperor in court.
This favor was truly... Cough cough. The emperor did not give Fan Xian any chance to speak. He also did not care if he accepted the edict or not. He directly nodded his head to Eunuch Yao.
Eunuch Yao immediately used a duck's voice that was different from Eunuch Dai's and called out, "Jiangnan Road Plenipotentiary Imperial Envoy Fan Xian, come forward to hear the edict."
Fan Xian paused.
He lifted the front of his robe and knelt down.
The edict spoke slowly. It did not mention the matter of the Imperial Censorate entering the Overwatch Council. Instead, it gave a general list of what Fan Xian had done this year in Jiangnan, placing particular emphasis on the matter of the Palace Treasury Transport Company. It praised Fan Xian's contributions to the National Treasury, and also mentioned the matter of Fan Xian helping Governor Xueqi investigate the governance of Jiangnan officials.
The emperor opened his mouth and said, "I think that Sir Fan Xian is loyal to the country and should be heavily rewarded."
The officials were silent. Although no one liked Fan Xian receiving another reward, the over 10 million liang of silver the palace treasury had shipped back to Jingdo was real. Such a large and solid contribution was worthy of an enemy's contribution.
If it was not heavily rewarded, the court did not know how to explain it to the people of the world.
Xueqi stepped out and added to Fan Xian's Jiangnan affairs. He was full of praise. Scholar who stepped out and also thought that Sir Fan Jr. should be heavily rewarded. Xu Wu's eyes spun a few times and then glanced at Fan Xian.
Finally, he couldn't resist stepping out and saying, "Your Majesty, half a year ago, the Hall of Governmental Affairs had a discussion. Given Sir Fan Jr.'s reputation, knowledge and achievements, it was truly enough for him to enter the Hall of Governmental Affairs to discuss matters.
However, Overwatch Council officials are never allowed to become court officials. The court had set the precedent. However, earlier, Sir Fan Jr. had intended to resign as commissioner of the Overwatch Council." The emperor coughed. Who the scholar also couldn't resist glancing at Xu Wu with a strange gaze, thinking that this old man was indeed stubborn. He clearly knew that the emperor would not allow Fan Xian to enter the pavilion, much less allow Fan Xian to leave the Overwatch Council. Yet, he still held on to the idea the two of them had half a year ago. However, Xu Wu had already spoken, so he could only express the same wish and recommend Fan Xian to enter the pavilion. Fan Xian had heard of this matter in the council reports, but seeing it with his own eyes, he couldn't help feeling surprised. He was not even 20 years old, yet he wanted to enter the pavilion. This was a bit too absurd. As expected, the emperor still did not allow it. He only had Eunuch Yao finish announcing the edict. After listening to the edict, Fan Xian froze where he was. A moment later, he remembered to give thanks.
He thought that it was indeed absurd for him to be a scholar, but the reward the emperor gave was also absurd.
The Duke of Danbois. The hall was filled with cries of surprise and praise. Fan Xian stood there in a daze, wondering how he had suddenly been made a duke. Wasn't this even higher than the old man's? The emperor's stick was ruthless, but the size of the sweets he gave was also not small. He was only one step away from becoming a prince, an incomparably noble title. He tilted his head to glance at the awkward He Zhongwei and wondered if he could casually beat him up in the future. Advertising to friends, http://mm.com web 1905516. ASPX. Colored glass beautiful demon. Thank you, everyone. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 468. Fan Xian's original title was a first-rank baron, second level, while a duke was superior.
In between, there was still the rank of marquis.
Given his present age, directly becoming a duke was truly a rare honor. Even he couldn't react for a moment. By the time the crowd reacted, they understood why. On one hand, the court wanted to reward him for his service in Jiangnan. On the other hand, everyone knew that the most important reason was that the emperor wanted to compensate his illegitimate son. The great prince and second prince had long been made princes. Fan Xian was only the Duke of Donbua. What did that count for? Thinking of this, the officials who had planned to stand out and fiercely oppose this reward all fell silent. This was a family matter of the royal family, not a national matter of the court. It was not their place to speak out. After Fan Xian's joy, he immediately calmed down. For most of the people in this hall, a duke was indeed a shiny golden word.
For him, the power in his hands had long exceeded this boundary. Furthermore, the emperor had not given him a greeting and had the imperial censorate squeeze into the Overwatch Council's sphere of influence.
This was the problem that Fan Xian truly cared about and feared.
Thus, he would rather throw away his previous description and pester endlessly than let the emperor easily stuff sand in.
Furthermore, he faintly knew that the position of duke was the final destination he could reach in the Qing kingdom. Presently, the Duke of Donbua was a third-level duke. There were still 2 more levels he could climb. After that, it looked like he would have to retire at such a young age. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but feel a bit perplexed and feel that it was absurd. He couldn't resist standing in the hall and laughing involuntarily. Everyone's attention was focused on the youngest duke since the founding of the Qing kingdom. Looking at his hateful smile, the emotions in their hearts were complicated. They felt that this laughter was incomparably ear-piercing. The court conference lasted until after lunch before it ended. This was because the official court discussions with the governors of the 3 roads had been delayed until later. The emperor cut the Gordian knot with a sharp knife. The emperor decided most of the matters alone and dismissed the officials. The officials had long been hungry. They all passed through the palace doors and returned to their manners. However, there were still some people who could not leave.
The officials of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, the governors of the 3 roads who had not returned to the capital in a long time, and the various ministers carefully followed the emperor to the royal study.
Fan Xian followed at the back with a helpless expression. Just like a year ago when he returned to the Qing kingdom from northern Qi, there was still a seat left for Fan Xian in the royal study. Last time, it was because of Zhuang Mohan's carriage of books. This time, it was because of the countless snowflake silver the palace treasury had sent over. Fan Xian sat on the round embroidered stool, feeling a little uneasy. The voices in the royal study discussing national affairs did not interest him. Government affairs had never been his strong suit, and he could not come up with any ideas. In the end, he could only play the role of picking up what was missing and making up for what was lacking.
It was clear that the emperor was aware of his abilities.
He also did not want Fan Xian to express too many opinions on national affairs, so he did not mention his name today. However, he, the newly promoted duke, still had a place to sit. Beside the emperor's soft couch, the crown prince and the other princes still had to stand obediently and listen and learn like students. Fan Xian felt good. He thought he could be considered the teacher of his royal brothers. The emperor and various figures discussed the snow disaster in the south, the situation in the north, and the auspicious signs in the garden. Then they began to put out the food. Fan Xian had been busy all night. The lamb slices and tofu pudding had long been digested. Hearing the food being put out, he couldn't help but feel his spirits rise. A sense of happiness rose in his heart like a walk-on finally having a boxed meal.
Accepting the food box the eunuch handed over, he ate without speaking and swept away everything.
The main matters had already been decided at the court conference. There was nothing new in the meeting in the royal study. It was just that when Xueqi occasionally brought up the Hangzhou Conference's excellent performance in the disaster relief matter in Jiangnan, the ministers in Jingdou expressed a glimmer of surprise. They had heard of the Hangzhou Conference, but they had not thought that the Hangzhou Conference would have such great wealth and power to be able to do so many things outside of the government's disaster relief. The emperor had Fan Xian rise to explain. Listening to Fan Xian's explanation, only then did Xu Wu and the others understand that behind the Hangzhou Conference were the ladies in the royal palace. In name, the leader was the Empress Dowager. No wonder the Hangzhou Conference had such power. However, everyone knew that the palace was only using the name of caring for the people. The one who truly did things and paid the silver was probably still Fan Xian. The emperor smiled and said, "The one who has truly worked hard is not Fan Xian. It is my Chen girl." The officials chuckled and said a few words of flattery.
They even loudly praised the nobles in the palace, especially the emperor.
The emperor looked at Fan Xian's slightly absent-minded face and furrowed his brows slightly. The great prince watched this scene from the side and said, "The princess is returning to the capital today." The emperor made an "oh" sound. When he looked at Fan Xian again, his gaze softened. He smiled but didn't say anything. He also didn't have Fan Xian return to the palace early. He only immediately ended the meeting in the royal study and asked Fan Xian, who wanted to return the most, to stay. The calming incense slowly floated in the royal study. Its color was not as milky as the white smoke. Its fragrance was very light. Only the emperor and Fan Xian were left in the royal study. Fan Xian felt slightly uncomfortable because he didn't know what the emperor was about to say. The emperor drank a mouthful of bird's nest and raised his head to glance at Fan Xian, indicating for him to want another mouthful. Fan Xian quickly shook his head. One cannot express one's will without tranquility. One cannot reach far. The emperor put down the bowl and slowly said, "Do not be troubled or worried, do not lose one's way. This was the explanation you gave to everyone when you opened that bookstore in Jingdo 2 years ago." Fan Xian nodded. The name of the Danbo bookstore came from this. However, Ruoro's sister knew his intentions and was different from others. She gave the explanation of drifting in Danzhou. Thinking of this, he suddenly missed that silly girl. He didn't know if she was having a good time in the north. "I like these 2 sentences of yours very much. You should know what it means for you to be the Duke of Danbo." The emperor calmly looked at his most accomplished illegitimate child. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then said seriously, "Express one's will and worry less." "Correct," the emperor calmly said. "You need to know what you should do, but think less about what you can do." A pure official? A lone official? In reality, the meaning was very simple. As an official of the emperor, one should not be troubled or worried. Fan Xian didn't know what he was thinking. The smile on his face appeared very sincere and relaxed. He opened his mouth and said, "I understand." For a ruler and official to respond, the one who said he understood should be the emperor. However, Fan Xian had said it so clearly, yet it did not seem strange. The emperor also did not show any displeasure. Serving to the side, Eunuch Yao's face was calm. During these 2 years, he had grown used to the emperor's treatment of Fan Xian being different. The emperor waved his hand. Eunuch Yao bowed and left the royal study. After a moment of silence, the emperor coldly said, "As for the matter of the imperial censor entering the Overwatch Council, you will understand in the future. I know your heart is good. However, the matters of court cannot be changed by the hearts of people." Fan Xian knew that there were not many people here, so he couldn't make a scene or act spoiled or forcefully resist. He could only remain silent. The emperor then slowly said, "It's still the same words. I know your heart. That is why I am very happy about what happened last night. However, I never thought you would be so forceful. It was a bit unexpected." Fan Xian's throat was a bit dry. After thinking for a moment, he replied solemnly, "The river has not burst its banks. I will first lead the water away to prevent the people from suffering." The emperor looked at Fan Xian's face and didn't say anything. After a long time, he nodded his head in relief. "However, have you thought about it? You have sucked out all the water, but there will be flowing water in the future. Who knows whether or not the water will once again overflow the banks. Thus, I thought that I would have to keep watching until the day the mountains collapse and the earth cave in. Only then would I know whether or not the water in the river will flow downstream or shamelessly break through my great banks. Child, you pretend to be fierce on the surface, but there is always a soft spot in your heart." The emperor's face became cold. He continued, "In my life, I only desire 2 things. The world and the inheritance. If I don't see their hearts clearly, how can I let go and conquer the world? Don't move anymore and watch with me." Fan Xian was silent and vigilant, not daring to reply. The emperor's first words were full of warning. The Duke of Danbo could forever only be a duke. Yet, he wanted him to keep watching with him and also wanted him to maintain his calm and not attack the second prince and crown prince's faction. This was another promise of a lifetime of glory and supreme trust. Also, don't waste time with Xueqi. The emperor stared into his eyes and said, "Xueqi has done a great service to the country and is a fierce general in the military. I don't want him to fall in these matters." Fan Xian froze slightly. He thought to himself that he and Governor Yan had formed an irreconcilable enmity. How could this be resolved? Besides, even if Yan Xueqi had done a great service to the country, His relationship with the eldest princess was too deep. Was the emperor not afraid at all? He finally confirmed that the person who had sent Eunuch Hong to break the situation last night was not the Empress Dowager but the emperor himself. He grew increasingly confused. In the martial conference, what if the governor challenges me? He glanced at the emperor and asked worriedly. The Qing kingdom revered martial arts. If Yan Xiaoyi challenged Fan Xian in the palace, the emperor could not say something like that in front of all the officials that Fan Xian was a prince and could not be harmed. Yan Xiaoyi will leave before the martial conference, the emperor said. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said, but the governor put his son's death on my account. The emperor glanced at him with a not quite there smile and said, did you kill him? Fan Xian replied sincerely, this matter indeed has nothing to do with me. I wouldn't dare to secretly kill the son of an official. The emperor laughed loudly. What a good wouldn't dare to secretly kill. Were the killings last night open killings? Fan Xian's face reddened and he said, the ones who moved last night were all Zhonghu people. It has nothing to do with the court. The emperor was silent for a moment and then said, the ones who moved in Yuantai camp were people from Dongyi, so I am curious as to whether or not there would be any problems over there. I want to see if Xiaoyi is a smart person. Fan Xian's expression was calm, but he was crying bitterly in his heart. 13th Wang, 13th Wang. You've even tricked the emperor. It was clear that the emperor had made an incorrect judgment because of this wrong source of information. Yet, Fan Xian could not, no matter what, warn him. As for Xiaoyi's problem, I must remind you that the military cannot fall into chaos. The emperor's gaze became deep and serene. He opened his mouth to sigh and said, the Hu chieftains in the west are making trouble again. The Hu people in the west were making trouble? Fan Xian raised his head in shock and looked at the emperor's slightly worried face. For a moment, he was so shocked he didn't know what to say. 20 years ago, the emperor had led an army on an expedition to the west and had already killed the people of Hu to the point of desolation. In addition, a few years ago, the great prince had led an army to sweep through the west. Why were the Hu people making trouble again? Furthermore, even if they did, given the strength of the Qing kingdom's military and the number of generals, the emperor would not be worried about the instability of military morale because of foreign aggression. Fan Xian had grown up in the Qing kingdom. He knew that when the Qing kingdom was first founded, it had been bullied and humiliated by Hu for a number of years. The Hu people had always been a great threat to the Qing kingdom. It was only during these 20 years, under the powerful suppression of the Qing emperor, that they had become disdainful of becoming a topic of conversation among the Qing people. The emperor looked at Fan Xian's shocked expression and smiled mockingly. The Qing kingdom has suffered disasters year after year. Droughts and floods add to each other, and snowstorms arrive. Coincidentally, Hu has had good weather these 2 years. The grass grows and the horses are fat. Of course, if that was all, the mere Hu barbarians would not make me so careful. However, did you know that before the Qing kingdom's snowstorm, the snowy barbarians to the north of northern Qi also suffered their biggest frost disaster in decades? Fan Xian furrowed his brows and suddenly thought of the matter Haitang Duo had once worriedly mentioned to him by the lake in Hangzhou half a year ago. Those northern barbarians had indeed suffered from a snowstorm. Countless cattle, sheep, and horses had frozen to death. However, the northern barbarians and Hu were very far apart. What did this have to do with the Qing kingdom? The emperor said, no wonder the northern Qi royal family dared to keep Shanhu in Shangjing and not worry about the northern barbarians coming south. Heaven is helping them. Those northern barbarians were frozen to death. Yet, because of Shanhu's many years of power, they did not dare to take the risk of going south. They could only go around the Qilian mountains in hopes of finding a way to survive. The Hu people live by water and grass. After half a year of migration, the northern barbarians have finally reached the territory of Hu. Although only 40,000 of the 200,000 tribes survived, those who survived in the wind and snow and on the dangerous path are all elites. Fan Xian's eyes narrowed slightly. It was as if the image of countless tribes driving weak sheep and horses, rolling up tattered tents, through the wind and snow, along the Qilian mountains towering into the clouds, desperately searching for a path to the west. Along the way, frozen corpses littered the ground and vultures cried out strangely. What a magnificent and tragic scene this was. What a great migration this was. How could Hu tolerate the northern tribes coming over? Fan Xian asked worriedly. The emperor laughed.
There was boundless confidence and pride in his laughter.
She who has long been crippled by us. How would they dare to eat these foreign snow wolves?
Although there are many more people in Xihu, after a few major battles, the two sides have still formed an alliance.
Fan Xian sighed.
If the Hu people truly formed an alliance, then the neighboring Qing kingdom would receive the greatest threat. No wonder the emperor was so careful when dealing with the military. Seeing Fan Xian's worry, the emperor calmly said, "What are you thinking about?"
"I am thinking that this information is probably still top secret. However, a great battle will probably come. I am willing to charge into the front lines." Fan Xian's words were not fake or pretty. He really did want to go to the grasslands and enjoy riding horses.
However, it seemed that no one had explained the internal problems of the court. The emperor smiled mockingly and said, "Don't think that just because you are a martial ace that you can lead troops into battle for military merit.
Once a great battle starts, millions of people will kill each other. Unless you are Uncle Lu Yun, you will still have a fate of being cut to pieces." Fan Xian laughed bitterly.
The emperor paused slightly and then calmly said, "The Hu barbarians are not to be feared.
I have never thought much of them. However, since the northern barbarians have moved, the pressure on northern Qi has immediately lessened. I have no choice but to look toward the north." Fan Xian immediately understood.
The emperor's gaze indeed moved faster than his. In this world, the only true enemy of the Qing kingdom was northern Qi, particularly since the northern barbarians had left.
Northern Qi had nothing to worry about.
Who knew if the little emperor would have other thoughts? In the end, the emperor slowly said, "Xueqi will return to the north in a few days because the little emperor in the north has finally convinced the empress dowager to have Hu rise again.
The main camp is charging toward Yanjing." Shock flashed through Fan Xian's eyes and he immediately restrained it.
Outside the royal palace in the black carriage, Fan Xian rubbed the space between his brows.
He felt a bit uncomfortable. For one, he was too tired. For another, he had heard too much bad news in the palace.
Just as the emperor had said, without a few years of rest, Xihu would not be able to pose a real threat to the Qing kingdom.
However, in northern Qi, Hu had returned. Hu. Fan Xian's head hurt when he thought of this name.
Although he had not seen the assassination on the long street that rainy night, he had always deeply understood the power of that famous general.
Could Yan Xiaoyi go to the north to stop Hu? Furthermore, Brother Xiaoyi had recently lost a son. He would probably gradually grow apart from the court. The emperor was not afraid that Yan Xiaoyi would go crazy and join the enemy. As for why Fan Xian was so wary of Hu's return, the reason was actually very simple. In Shangjing, he had ruthlessly schemed against Hu and caused countless of his subordinates to die wretchedly. In the middle of the night, a cry of "Fan Xian, the one who killed me," was probably still echoing in northern Qi's Shangjing. Furthermore, Hu's adoptive father, Sir Xiaoan, had been captured and killed by him again and again. In this matter, Fan Xian was Hu's greatest enemy. Shan Zhong was only a minor character. For the sake of revenge, Hu had killed Shen Zhong with a spear in that rainy night. If they actually met on the battlefield in the future, how would Hu deal with him? Fan Xian thought sorrowfully in the carriage.
There were so many enemies in this world.
I just couldn't find a way to add quality to the replies in the new book review section. Whoosh. Everyone, forgive my stupidity. Tomorrow is Monday. Everyone has to work and go to school again. I wish you peace. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 469. The emperor had once said in the palace that if he wanted to use Yan Xiaoyi, he dared to use little Yan Xiaoyi. At that time, Fan Xian wished he could stretch out a microphone and ask him, "What exactly are you feeling?" What exactly was his mood like? If one had to look at a person's heart, be careful not to look until you bleed from every orifice. Until now, Fan Xian only had a faint feeling for the emperor. Logically speaking, he did not need to worry so much about the survival of the Qing kingdom and the life and death of the emperor. For the future of himself and his family, he had no choice but to do his utmost. This was helpless. The carriage left the South City Gate. The four wheels bumped against the hard ridge in succession. Fan Xian, who had been in a daze, immediately woke up. Lifting the curtain, he walked out. As he yawned, he looked toward the road to the south. It was already afternoon. There were not many people entering the city. The city gate guards responsible for the city gates and the soldiers responsible for defense of the Jingdo garrison were carrying out their daily work with boredom. Suddenly, they saw a black carriage arrive at the city gate under the protection of a dozen Overwatch Council officials. Everyone's hearts jumped. Looking at the yawning young official under the carriage, everyone immediately guessed his identity. The commander of the Tiannan city gate guards had received the news and quickly ran over. He brought a long bench and offered Fan Xian hot tea. Fan Xian did not stand on ceremony. Holding the teacup, he gulped it down in large gulps. Before long, the figure of a group of carriages appeared at the end of the road. Following the row of wild trees on the horizon, they gradually came closer and closer. In a moment, they had arrived in front of the city gate. Fan Xian went up to welcome them. The group of carriages stopped. Gao Da and 7 other tiger guards stepped out of the carriage, as well as a group of 6th Bureau swordsmen. With a swish, they knelt on the ground and bowed to him. Fan Xian waved his hand and had them rise. He couldn't help saying a few warm words of praise, but his feet did not stop. He climbed directly into the carriage in the middle. Lifting the curtain, he saw Wana holding a blue cloth bag and dozing off. Her long eyelashes rested peacefully on her pale skin. A lock of bangs fell peacefully on her forehead, hiding a girl's tiredness. Fan Xian didn't want to wake her up. He just sat by her side and took the blue cloth bag from her arms. At the same time, he glanced at the person opposite him with confusion. Xueqi, who was sitting across from him, blinked her eyes and said in a small voice, "We did it for a long time last night. Our spirits aren't very good today." Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything more. He signaled for the carriages to enter the city. He only reminded Gao Da and the others in a quiet voice to be careful when they entered the city gate ridge and not wake the person in the carriage. The carriage passed through half the streets of Jingdo and came to a quiet street in the south of the city. It stopped in front of the main gate of Fan Manor. The carriage stopped, and Warner woke up in a daze. She subconsciously hugged the arm next to her and rubbed against it. She felt a warmth that she hadn't felt for a long time return to her side. She snuggled deeper into the warmer embrace. But she woke up immediately. The girl jumped in fright and jumped up. Only then did she realize that beside her was Fan Xian, who had already fallen asleep. She put her heart back into her stomach. Looking at the familiar face that she had not seen in a long time, she couldn't resist smiling innocently and sticking out her tongue. Clap, 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 clap. A string of noisy firecrackers rang out and startled Fan Xian out of his dreams. He grumbled angrily and pulled his arm back to find that he was hugging empty air. Puzzled, he opened his eyes to look and saw his wife curled up in the corner of the chair, looking at him. Earlier, Warner had stared at Fan Xian in a daze. A moment later, she realized that Xueqi was also across from him. She also discovered that Fan Xian had been startled awake by the firecrackers. For a moment, she felt very awkward and blushed. Fan Xian gazed at his wife and smiled. With one hand holding the blue cloth bundle, he led her out of the carriage. He didn't say anything in detail. On the contrary, he grumbled, "Which manor is getting a new bride? Why is it so lively?" Warner covered her mouth and smiled. Pointing at the main gate of Fan Manor, she said, "I also think it's strange. It's our family that is setting off firecrackers. I wonder what joyous event it is." At this time, Xueqi also came down with her small bundle. Looking at the busy scene of people coming and going in front of the main gate of Fan Manor, red lanterns hanging high, and firecrackers exploding, she also jumped in fright. With a cry, she said in a loud voice, "Young master, young mistress, are you welcoming us back from Zhongnan?" The group of carriages stopped in front of Fan Manor's gate. Fan Xian looked at this scene with curiosity. He couldn't resist grabbing Xueqi, who had come out of the manor to welcome him, and asked, "Sir Zheng, what is going on?" Xueqi laughed and said, "Young master, you have been made the Duke of Donbo today. This is a joyous occasion. Countless people from various departments and pavilions have come to congratulate you. At this moment, they are all waiting in the manor for your return. Of course, we have to properly celebrate such a glorious event." Fan Xian paused. Only now did he remember that he had become a duke.
raising his head to look at the red cloth hanging on the Fan Manor's plaque. He couldn't resist smiling bitterly. Lin Wanner glanced at him in shock and asked, "Husband, you have been made a duke?"
Fan Xian nodded. Hearing these words, Lin Wanner's brows were full of joy. Even Xueqi, who was beside her, could not escape. She was very happy.
After all, in this world, these things were always important. For an official to be made a duke at Fan Xian's age, no matter where it was placed, it was a particularly glorious matter.
Along the way, there were officials who came forward to congratulate and bow. Fan Xian hurriedly returned the greeting.
He could only have the wife of the Teng family come out and first take Wanner, Xueqi, and the serving girls into the inner manor. The faces of the servants of the Fan Manor were full of joy.
They continuously knelt and kowtowed toward Fan Xian. Reward, reward. Along the way, there were rewards given out. Fan Xian did not feel any pain.
However, he felt that there was no need to be so happy.
Even Wanner and Xueqi were so happy. If his sister was home, who knew if she would also be overjoyed?
After finally tidying up everything and properly seeing off the guests, the Fan Manor finally gathered in the flower hall in the garden.
Lady Lu sat by Fan Zhen's side. Her brows were also full of smiles.
Xueqi had just returned to the Fan Manor when she was given the glorious task of arranging the banquet.
In the past, this task had always been the responsibility of Lady Lu, who was not an official member of the family. This meant that the Fan Manor had already acknowledged Xueqi's position. Fan Zhen said a few words to his subordinate son and wife and then talked about Xueqi's matter. In any case, it had already been done in Danzhou.
With the old ancestor's approval, he, as the master of the Fan Manor, would not say anything more. After the banquet was prepared, there were no other people in the flower hall.
Fan Xija, who had been cooped up at home, finally ran out. He first greeted his sister-in-law and then sat by Fan Xian's side, shamelessly asking for a favor. Wan'er was startled. Wasn't her brother-in-law in northern Qi? Why did he sneak back? Fan Xian opened his mouth to scold. It's just a lousy title of nobility. Is it worth it for you to be so greedy?
Fan Xija shrunk his neck and said, "You don't really care. How many dukes are there in this world?"
Fan Xian smiled and said, "But you don't need to ask for a reward from me. Do you think you're lacking in silver?"
"I think in another 2 years, Father and I will have to stretch out our hands to ask you for money."
Fan Xija chuckled and said, "Even silver can't buy Big Brother's reputation. In the future you will be a prince. When will you think of a way to get me a title of nobility?" Fan Xian paused. Only now did he remember that after the Baoyue brothel incident last autumn, Fan Xija had been issued an arrest warrant by the Ministry of Justice. The title of nobility he had received since he was a child had been removed. Hearing the word prince, Fan Xian still felt a little strange. He and his father met each other's eyes. They both understood the judgment in each other's hearts. Given Fan Xian's identity, being a first-rate duke was the limit. No matter what, he could not become a prince. Unless something happened in the future. The banquet immediately became silent. Fan Xija also knew that there was something wrong with what he said and didn't dare say anything else. Wanner looked at this scene and smiled charmingly. She said to her brother-in-law, "Since you're back, don't be in such a hurry to leave. After dinner, play a few more rounds with father and mother." Once Fan Xija heard that he was going to play mahjong, and it was his sister-in-law who had suggested it, he immediately perked up. He had not met a match at the mahjong table in northern Qi for more than a year. Tonight, he was going to play against his sister-in-law, the second best in the world. He was very excited. The next few days were peaceful. There were not many stories to tell. The second prince's faction was beaten until everyone was panicking. The eldest princess sat calmly in the palace, thinking about something. Fan Xian only occasionally thought of the crown prince's strange behavior in Baoyue brothel and became very confused. This crown prince was the rightful heir to the throne of Qing Kingdom. Naturally, the method he chose to respond was the best one. However, looking at the way the situation was going, where did his confidence come from? Fan Xian couldn't figure this out. Fan Jian also didn't figure it out. The crown prince dared to watch so coldly from the sidelines unless he had a powerful helper in his hands. However, the eldest princess, who had originally supported him, had long been exposed by Fan Xian to her relationship with the second prince. What right did the crown prince have to believe the eldest princess' words again? Since he couldn't figure it out, he stopped thinking about it. He still had to return to Jiangnan next spring. After the new year, there were places like Chen Garden, King Jing's Manor, and the Great Prince's Manor that he had to visit. Thus, taking advantage of the few days before the new year, Fan Xian didn't go to the Overwatch Council or enter the palace.
He just stayed obediently in the Fan Manor, being filial to his father, whom he hadn't seen in a year, and disciplining his brother, who had been in the north for a long time.
The atmosphere of a family reunion was not bad. However, it was missing Ruoruo and the old ancestor of Danzhou. At one time, Fan Xian had once privately said to his father that his grandmother had not seen Xija for a long time. Should he find a time for Xija to return to Danzhou? Fan Jian thought about it. It was indeed reasonable, so he let Fan Xian make the arrangements.
Just as the situation was developing in a peaceful manner, on the 28th of the 12th month, an uninvited guest came to the Fan Manor.
This guest was Northern Qi's envoy to the Qing kingdom.
His identity was a bit sensitive, but he had specially reported to the office of the Grand Herald before coming to the front door of the Fan Manor.
Everyone in the Fan Manor felt it was strange, but they could only open the front door to welcome him. This envoy was very respectful to Fan Xian and represented the Northern Qi court in conveying their condolences to Fan Xian. He said that regarding the attack in the valley, the Northern Qi people felt the same and deeply felt injustice for Sir Fan Jr. After putting down a large pile of gifts, the envoy left the manor, leaving only Fan Jian and Fan Xian looking at each other stupidly. That night, someone from the office of the Grand Herald of the Qing Kingdom came. A eunuch from the internal court also came to explain to Fan Xian why the Northern Qi envoy had come to visit. The news of Fan Xian's assassination had already reached Northern Qi. For some reason, the Northern Qi emperor had personally written a private letter and asked someone to send it to the Qing emperor. He expressed his concern about Fan Xian's assassination, and expressed hidden criticism of the Qing court for not paying attention to Fan Xian's personal safety.
Hearing these words, Fan Xian looked at the eunuch and the vice minister of the office of the Grand Herald and sucked in a breath of cold air. He opened his mouth and cursed, wrinkling a pond of spring water, none of their *king business. The vice minister of the office of the Grand Herald and the eunuch looked at each other awkwardly.
We all understand what the Northern Qi people are thinking. Sir Fan Jr., there is no need to be so angry. What use is such a dirty trick? The eunuch also said with a sinister smile, if they want to give you gifts, just accept them.
After seeing the two of them out of the manor, Fan Xian hurried into the study and asked his father, what exactly do the Northern Qi people want?
Do they have the right to express concern about this matter? Fan Jian forced a smile and said, there is something I've always forgotten to tell you. The emperor also seems to have forgotten about this.
When you went to Northern Qi as a diplomatic envoy, didn't you promise their emperor in the royal palace in Shangjing that when you had time, you would go to their imperial college to give a lecture?
Fan Xian thought about it seriously. It seemed that there really was such a thing, but he didn't seem to have agreed.
Fan Jian sighed and said, when you went to Jiangnan, the Northern Qi people sent a document to the office of the Grand Herald saying they wanted to hire you as a visiting professor at the imperial college in Shangjing. The emperor only thought the little emperor was bored and didn't think much of it. Who would have thought that the Northern Qi people were waiting here? Now that you are a visiting professor at the imperial college in Shangjing and have been assassinated in the Qing kingdom, it seems reasonable for them to express concern and anger. Fan Xian said angrily and bitterly, what good does it do for them to play tricks on me at this time? Fan Jian raised his head and glanced at his son. He shook his head and said, although it is a crude method and someone with some brains wouldn't believe this kind of provocation, your shady dealings with the Northern Qi people in Jiangnan cannot be hidden forever. After accumulating and destroying them, who knows whether or not the emperor will suspect you in the future? They only need to send some gifts, bring a few words, and lose some face. Then they can take root in your throat. This kind of business is very profitable. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and felt great anger. The valley attack. Yet the little emperor of Northern Qi has unexpectedly caused trouble. It looks like the court will not continue investigating. Fan Jian glanced at him and smiled bitterly. Originally, the emperor didn't want to investigate. Now that there is such a useful reason, how can he bear to not use it? Fan Xian also smiled bitterly. A moment later he said seriously to his father, Father, on the first day of the year, I want to enter the ancestral hall. Fan Jian was not very surprised.
From the moment the emperor had officially granted Fan Xian the title of Duke of Donbua, he had understood the emperor's thoughts.
He only calmly said, "I want to enter the palace and ask clearly about this matter."
To be continued. If you want to know what happened afterwards, please log on to www.chidian.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 470. Just as the people in Baoyue brothel had once said, Jingdo had been peaceful for a year. The biggest reason was because Fan Xian had been exiled to Jiangnan for an entire year. Following Fan Xian's return to the capital, the peaceful Jingdo could no longer maintain its apparent calm.
For one, he just so happened to be at the point of conflict between various powers. For another, his style of doing things was completely different from that of a so-called immortal poet. It was even much more ruthless than the style of most of the nobles in the Qing kingdom. The attack in the valley, the assassination in the night in Jingdo, the silent deaths of certain people, and the humiliating imprisonment of certain officials made the nobles in Jingdo once again deeply feel Fan Xian's power and determination. It made them understand that Sir Fan Jr. had been raised in the spring sunshine of Jiangnan for a year, but it had not made his personality much gentler. After Fan Xian returned to the capital, shocking things happened one after another. The most recent thing was that the northern Qi court had shamelessly come over and shamelessly expressed their love for Fan Xian. With unusual disgust, they criticized the Qing court for not protecting Sir Fan Jr.'s safety. Everyone in Jingdo found this absurd and angry. To put it another way, this was Qing domestic politics. When was it the place for rotten northern Qi scholars to speak up? However, the northern Qi people had spoken up, and they had spoken up particularly loudly. In an instant, Fan Xian was pushed to the heart of the struggle. Although the clever people did not believe that he had any shameful collusion with Northern Qi because Northern Qi's methods were too childish, the nobles and common people of the Qing kingdom still felt uncomfortable in their hearts. The gazes they turned toward the Fan manor were complicated. The storm of this matter had not calmed. In just 2 days, on the first day of the new year, the entire Jingdo became fearful because of another matter related to the Fan manor. There was not a glimmer of light in the sky. Fan Xian sat in the carriage and rubbed his slightly sore eyes. He thought to himself, is there a need to be so sneaky about paying respects to the ancestors? Yesterday was New Year's Eve, and the whole family played mahjong through the night. After Fan Xizha and Lin Wanner divided up the family's assets, the mahjong game ended, and the whole family immediately got on the carriage and left the manor. Along the way, there were carriages from the other branches of the Fan clan converging together. Although each branch was calm, such a long line of carriages did indeed appear to be rather large. Fan Xian felt a faint excitement and nervousness in his heart. This was the first time he was paying respects to the ancestors, so he didn't know it should be at the 5th watch. Last year, when Fan Manor paid respects to the ancestors, he and Wanner had stayed in the garden. He vaguely remembered that it should have been in the afternoon. He glanced at the sleeping Xizha beside him and couldn't resist shaking his head with a smile. In his own carriage, presumably no yamen in the Qing kingdom would be blind enough to search for Xizha, this criminal. Thinking that he could finally enter the ancestral hall today, the smile on his face never faded. He did not know how his father had negotiated with the emperor when he entered the palace, but in the end, it was clear that the emperor had helplessly nodded and the empress dowager had maintained her silence. Speaking of which, since the royal family could not give him a title, did they want him to never have a reliable surname for the rest of his life? Fan Xian smiled coldly. In reality, he could guess the outcome of his father's negotiations with the emperor. The emperor had made him the Duke of Donbua. In his opinion, he had already given enough of an explanation. Furthermore, given the situation at hand, the emperor did indeed need Fan Xian to clarify his identity to prevent his son's fight for the family property from becoming more complicated. The Overwatch Council's reduction of power was far from enough. If Fan Xian wanted to continue walking the path of a powerful official, the first thing he had to do was remove himself from the ranks of the princes. The carriages traveled for an indeterminable amount of time and waited for a while outside the city gates. When the gates opened, they drove out under the soldiers' unconcerned gazes. Following the official road all the way west, they finally entered the country estate that Fan Xian had once visited, the Fan clan's ancestral property. Over 30 carriages lined up and stopped on the dam outside the ancestral hall. The people of the country estate had long come to receive them. It was like this every year.
They had all become skilled workers. Temporary bamboo shelters for the women to sit in had long been put up.
Lady Lu, Warner, Cece, and the elders and women of the other branches had all been received into the courtyard to rest.
The present leader of the Fan clan, Minister of Revenue Fan Jian, stood at the bottom of the steps of the ancestral hall. He wore a tricolored formal robe and looked calmly at everything in front of him.
However, a warm and happy feeling welled up in his heart.
He had raised a son for the emperor and finally raised his own son. Could this be considered the most successful day of his life? The leading figures of each branch of the Fan clan had already disembarked from the carriages and stood in order of seniority outside the ancestral hall. They stole glances at the leader at the head of the table. Each of them had complicated emotions in their hearts. 30 years ago, the Fan clan was already one of the large clans in the capital. Fan Jian's branch was only a side branch and weak family. If it had not been for that old ancestor who had supported the present emperor and King Jing, how could Fan Jian have become the leader of the clan? After Fan Jian became the leader, he was very strict with the members of the clan. His own official position grew higher and higher. No one in the clan dared to disobey him. Furthermore, there was now another person called Fan Xian in the Fan Manor. Everyone put down the clothes they needed to worship the ancestors. Peace incense was lit. The sacrificial items had already been prepared. The monk who often served in the ancestral hall respectfully spread out a row of felt blankets and slowly pulled open the main doors of the ancestral hall. With a creak, the doors made of black wood were pulled open. A gust of cold wind surged out from inside. It was as if the ancestors of the Fan clan were coldly watching their descendants. The hundreds of men of the Fan clan lowered their heads and lined up. At this time, the door of a carriage behind them opened. Fan Xian, dressed in cloth clothing, calmly stepped out. Following his father's hand signal at the bottom of the stone steps, he slowly moved forward between the two groups of men. The atmosphere in front of the ancestral hall had been solemn. The men of the Fan clan didn't even dare to breathe too loudly for fear of disturbing the spirits of their ancestors. However, when they saw the man who walked down from the carriage, they still couldn't help but widen their eyes in shock and surprise. Their mouths gaped open as they let out countless sighs of surprise. At the back of the line were the teenagers. After seeing Fan Xian, they were even more frightened. These were the pitiful little overlords whose legs had been broken by Fan Xian outside Baoyue brothel, and whose buttocks had been smashed by Lady Lu in the Fan Manor. Fan Xian had also come to worship the ancestors. These little overlords of the Fan clan were so frightened that their legs trembled. Fan Xian walked steadily forward and gradually approached the stone steps of the ancestral hall.
He saw that at the bottom of the steps, his father seemed to be arguing about something in a low voice with a few elders.
Fan Xian had seen those elders before.
He knew that they were virtuous and well-respected elders in the Fan clan.
One of them seemed to be someone he had to call uncle. The face of the highest-ranking uncle in the Fan clan was full of worry. He quietly said to Fan Jian, "Ida, this is not appropriate." Fan Jian smiled slightly and said, "Second uncle, what is not appropriate?" The uncle's eyes were full of fear.
Lowering his voice he said, this child.
He suddenly stopped talking. Did he have to say in front of the clan leader that his son was not his own? But he was still terrified. The elders of the Fan clan in front and behind him were also terrified. They had not thought that this year's worship of the ancestors would create such a large ruckus. It was all because the manor had quietly brought Fan Xian here. Everyone began to talk at once. Although they didn't dare say it openly in front of Minister Fan, they all vaguely expressed their worry. However, they didn't dare speak too loudly for fear of disturbing the ancestors in the ancestral hall. Everyone was dissatisfied. They thought, he is not a descendant of the Fan family. What right does he have to worship the ancestors? What they were more afraid of was that Fan Xian was the son of the dragon. Would the Empress Dowager and the Emperor be unhappy that he had returned to the Fan family? Fan Xian did not give these elders a chance to start a debate. He had already walked in front of his father. First, he bowed respectfully to the elders and then stood by his father's side. Fan Jian smiled slightly and pointed to a spot in the line. "Your place is there." Seeing that the clan leader would not listen, no one dared to object. These elders of the Fan clan were actually more afraid of the scent that Fan Xian carried on his body. The ancestors are meritorious, the clan is virtuous. All things come from heaven, man from the ancestors. White smoke curled around the inside and outside of the ancestral hall. Utensils were on display. The men kowtowed one by one. Amidst the rising and falling chanting, the Fan clan's worship of the ancestors proceeded steadily. However, people couldn't resist sneaking a few glances at Fan Xian. Fan Xian had already knelt, bowed, and kowtowed in the ancestral hall. Now, he stood to the side and looked at the paper flowers filling the sky and the snow on the distant mountaintop in a daze. He knew that his name could finally be recorded in the Fan clan's genealogy. For a moment, a bright color appeared in the depths of his heart. Fan Xizha kowtowed in the direction of the ancestral hall in the carriage. It was not convenient for him to get off. Fan Xian stood by the carriage and couldn't resist sighing. He thought to himself that he had been reborn. In the cave in northern Qixi Mountain, in front of the dying Xiao En, he had acknowledged his belonging to this world. Now, in front of the Fan clan's ancestral hall, he had once again confirmed his belonging to this world. His life had finally been branded with an indelible mark. He was intimately connected to this world and could no longer be separated. The morning light arrived early. The white fog in the country estate and the fog in the ancestral hall mixed together and could no longer be separated. As Fan Xian stood by the carriage outside the ancestral hall of the Fan clan inside, almost at the same time, across half of the Qing kingdom's territory, in one of the largest manors in the world outside Suzhou in Jiangnan, Xueqi knelt in front of the ancestral tablets and cried silently outside the ancestral hall that was even taller and more majestic than the Fan clan's ancestral hall. No, it should be said that the present seventh young master of the Ming family, Ming Qingqing, trembled in front of the ancestral tablets and allowed tears to wash his face. The current head of the Ming family, Ming Qingda, used a complicated gaze to look at the crying Ming Qingqing, his seventh brother who had left home when he was young. Ming Lansher stood below fourth uncle and looked at this seventh uncle, who had never had the opportunity to enter the ancestral hall to worship the ancestors. His face remained calm, but the depths of his heart were filled with a sense of defeat. Fourth uncle had been released by the Suzhou government half a year ago. From then on, he began to be tied together with Xueqi and opposed the Ming family at every turn. Without question, that failed assassination had made the fourth Ming master give up on the Ming family leader. The Ming family's situation was difficult. There was too little silver to circulate, so they could only stretch out their hands. Although Zhaoshang Money House had provided great help, if the business on the Eastern Road and on the sea did not improve much and they continued to borrow money, then there would be too many problems. Furthermore, there was now another power within the family. His aunt's son stood by the fourth Ming master's side. Thinking of this, Ming Lansher hated the imperial envoy far away in Jingdou. The present situation had been single-handedly created by that person, including Xueqi entering the ancestral hall to worship the ancestors and return to the ancestral home. It was also part of the agreement made back then. Ming Lansher didn't know why his father would agree to this request. Xueqi wiped away the tears on his face and knelt on the ground. Facing the ancestral tablets, he quietly said in a voice only he could hear, "Father, mother, that old witch is already dead. I have finally returned." Ever since he was a child, he had been chased out of the Ming family home and had escaped death countless times. Even when he later became the commander of the Jiangnan water bandits, he had only thought of one day using blood and fire to get revenge. However, he himself could only become a lonely ghost. He had never dared to hope that he could openly return to the Ming family. Presently, he was not only the commander of the Jiangnan water bandits, but also the unknown supervisor of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council stationed in Jiangnan Road. He was already the owner of Xiamingji and was responsible for the sale of palace treasury goods in northern Qi Road. At this moment, he had also obtained the identity of the 7th young master of the Ming family. In the future, the Ming family's enormous fortune would have his share. It might even all be his. Of course, Xueqi knew that even if the Ming family became his in the future, what was his would also be Sir Fan Jr.'s. Everything he had now was given to him by Sir Fan Jr. with both hands. Xueqi was a person who knew how to repay kindness. He was also someone who knew his limits and did not have too much ambition. As long as he could get his revenge and return to the Ming family, everything was fine. The 4th Ming master, who had long lost the ruthlessness of the past, went forward and helped him up. Comfortingly he said, "7th brother, as long as you're back it's fine." "Thank you, 4th brother." Xueqi stood and stared blankly at the head of the Ming family. Shortly after, he smiled and said, "Big brother, then I'll go out first." Ming Qingda smiled slightly and walked a few steps closer.
Moving close to his ear, he said in a quiet voice that only the two of them could hear, "Seventh brother, there is still a lot of time.
I won't keep you for a meal today." This was something he had forcefully forced Ming Qingda to agree to before he left Jiangnan.
Since he had already done it, he did not have much of a good attitude toward the seventh Ming master.
Xueqi laughed coldly. He knew the hidden meaning in Ming Qingda's words. Jiangnan and the Ming family were now split into two. As for who would be the leader, it would still depend on the outcome of the struggle in the palace in Jingdo. During this year, Ming Qingda had endured silently and used all his methods to delay Fan Xian's ruthless methods in order to buy time and wait for Jingdo's counterattack. He believed that he wouldn't have to endure for much longer. However, Xueqi's thoughts were the exact opposite of Ming Qingda's. He was also waiting. He was waiting for the day that Sir Fan Jr. would completely win. He had never believed that Sir Fan Jr. would fail. Walking out of the main door of the Ming Ancestral Hall, Xueqi glanced at the various expressions of the clan disciples in the garden. A self-mocking smile appeared on his face. Thinking about it, not many of these clan disciples truly saw him as the seventh master. The fourth Ming master had been following by his side the entire time.
In a quiet voice he said, "Although we already have 3 people on our side, he is, after all, the head of the family.
Some things cannot be hidden from him. We don't need to worry about business." Traces of tears remained at the corners of Xueqi's eyes. Calmly he said, "Put as many guards in the garden as you can. I will send someone to keep an eye on it.
If after the situation is settled and he still wants to struggle at death's door, then don't blame us for being heavy-handed."
The fourth master was startled and furrowed his brows. "Don't mess around. All of Jiangnan is watching Ming Garden.
Even Sir Fan Jr. would not dare to do such a thing."
Xueqi was startled. He didn't say anything more and walked out of Ming Garden. Outside the garden, beside the carriage, Su Wumei, who had lost an arm, was waiting for him. She looked at the traces left on Xueqi's face and knew that he must have suffered a great emotional upheaval. She forcefully suppressed her excitement and said, "Congratulations, First Master." Xueqi smiled. "Congratulations, cousin." Su Wumei smiled warmly. "Congratulations, Seventh Master." On the first day of the new year, in the manor of Jingdo, the second prince was drinking tea and playing Go with Yiling. Suddenly, he heard the sound of hurried footsteps coming from outside the study. He couldn't help furrowing his brows slightly. Although his power in Jingdo had been completely uprooted by Fan Xian, it was just as he had said in Baoyue Brothel. He was not worried at all because these were only minor problems. As long as Fan Xian could not touch him, the root of the royal family, in the future, it would be Fan Xian's turn to be worried. The housekeeper knocked and entered. Disregarding Wang Fei sitting in her seat, he hurriedly moved closer to the second prince's ear and told him the shocking news he had just heard. The second prince's expression immediately changed. The black, matte chess piece between his 2 fingers fell into the teacup and made a pft. After the housekeeper left, Yiling asked with a smile, "What happened now?" In the eyes of this young imperial concubine who was not yet 20, the more wretchedly her husband was beaten by her teacher, the better. It would be best if he was beaten until his heart gave out and he no longer cared about the matter of the dragon chair. Fan Xian was beating the tiger in Jingdo while Yiling was secretly laughing in the manor. Seeing the shock on her husband's face, she thought that her teacher was doing something again, so she was not worried. On the contrary, she had the urge to watch a good show. It took a long time for the second prince to ease the shock in his heart. Looking at his wife in astonishment, he said, "Fan Xian, he went to worship the ancestors today." Chapter 471. Yesterday, I typed the one-armed sister's surname incorrectly. My original surname was Guan, but I had no choice but to follow Su. Here, I deeply apologize. P.S. This book is very easy to buy. Next week, I'll go to the specialty store and say, "The cheapest one." Yiling made a sound and covered her mouth. She was so shocked that she couldn't speak. Although she had spent every day in Fan Xian's manor and played mahjong on the Tsong Mountains after Fan Xian had come to the capital, She had some understanding of her young master's will. She had never imagined that at this juncture, Fan Xian would bravely choose to return to the family. The second prince glanced at her and smiled bitterly. I'm wondering if Fan Xian has gone crazy. Why do you say that? A glimmer of doubt flashed through Yi Linger's jade-like eyes. Since Fan Xian dared to worship his ancestors, it must have been something that the Empress Dowager and the Emperor had tacitly agreed to. Why did her husband still think Fan Xian had gone crazy? The second prince shook his head. For the present Fan Xian, there are only 4 paths he can take. By choosing to return to his ancestral home, he has directly blocked off 2 of them. Yi Linger did not continue to ask. She listened quietly. The second prince thought for a moment and then quietly said, right now, he has too much power in his hands. He has offended too many people. The power of a lone official has already formed, for him, in the future, in Qing Kingdom, he will either fight with us for the throne, or he will support the third prince to rise to power while he hides behind the scenes and becomes a regent. Only these 2 paths can ensure the peace of his family and not be uprooted. Since he has returned to the Fan family, naturally, the possibility of him inheriting the throne has been severed. It is impossible to use the identity of a member of the royal family to act as regent. Yi Linger furrowed her brows. Even if he does not acknowledge his ancestral home, given his past, not to mention whether or not the emperor will allow him to inherit the throne, the entire royal family and the scholars of the court will not agree. This first option in itself is impossible. What is impossible? The second prince asked. As long as he does not return to the Fan family, there is a chance that the palace will accept him again. Adding to the power in his hands, who dares to say that it is impossible for him to fight for the world? What about the second item? A prince regent might be able to make the nobles in the palace and the royal family military outside the palace remain silent, as long as his surname is Li. But for a powerful official with the surname Fan to threaten the emperor and order the feudal vassals, that is impossible. The second prince calmly said, that is why Fan Xian's return today directly cut off the 2 paths he mentioned earlier. I don't understand what exactly he is thinking. What are the other 2 paths? Yi Linger looked at the strange expression on the prince's face and suddenly felt a chill in her heart. The second prince paused for a moment and then said, in the future, after father passes away, regardless of who ascends to the throne, I'm afraid they will carry out a great purge of Fan Xian and the Fan clan. If they don't purge, no one has the confidence to completely control the situation. These were the words the second prince had said to Fan Xian in Baoyue brothel. He had always thought that Fan Xian would gradually integrate into the royal family and fight for a position on the surface. Regardless of whether Fan Xian fought for the dragon chair himself or helped the third prince, they were both possible paths. Given Fan Xian's present strength, as well as the old people he influenced in front of and behind of him, no newly ascended emperor would be able to safely watch him live. Thus, many years from now, Fan Xian will only have 2 paths he can take. The second prince furrowed his brows tightly and could not understand it no matter how he thought about it. Otherwise, he will wait helplessly and have his entire clan executed, just like the Yi family in the past. He paused and then said tiredly, otherwise he will use the power in his hands to rebel and leave the country. He began to laugh self-mockingly. Of course, the power in his hands is all paper. He won't be able to raise much of a storm. Father is a cautious person. If Fan Xian doesn't have an army in his hands, he will never be able to truly become a marquis. Yi Linger was startled and carefully savored these words he said. She realized that if the situation really continued to develop like this, her teacher would indeed not have a good end. Her little face swelled slightly and she said, you've forgotten a possibility. If the third prince really does inherit the throne in the future, given his teacher-student relationship with Fan Xian, he may not necessarily let things happen to an irreversible state. The second prince smiled. I've also said this to Fan Xian. Third brother is still young, but I've watched him grow up. This kid is not easy to deal with. Furthermore, at what position you have to consider the level of affairs. Sometimes, it's not something you or I can stop doing just because we don't want to. He calmly said. Furthermore, don't forget, the crown prince is the true successor. Many people seem to have forgotten this matter because of his calmness, but I believe that Fan Xian will not forget. Most importantly, the second prince slowly lowered his head. Regardless of who inherits the throne, before our father leaves this world, will he watch as Fan Xian continues to gather the power of a large group of old monsters and bring endless trouble to his successor? This country is our father's country. He will not let this country become too chaotic, even if he dies. Regardless of whether the second prince was a son or an official, it was already a great taboo to discuss the emperor's life and death. Yi Ling bit her lip and didn't reply. Instead, she changed the subject and asked, "But this is not the life Fan Xian wants to live. This is what the elders in court have arranged for him. If you were Fan Xian, what would you do?" The second prince was startled. A moment later he self-deprecatingly said, "I don't know what I would do. It would probably be similar to his current situation. However, in the battle for the world, if you don't advance, you die. Since he has personally given up on the first two paths, then he should retreat more thoroughly. If I were in his position, at this time, I would enter the palace and ask for my resignation. Regardless of whether it is the Overwatch Council or the palace treasury, he will have to let one of them go. Then, from a purely rational point of view, he should appear more gentle and then secretly lean toward my side." Yi Ling looked at him. The second prince said seriously, "This is the wisest choice. Presumably, he knows in his heart that I dare to accept him. After all, my aunt is his mother-in-law. With Chen Er's relationship, it is not necessarily impossible to let go of past enmity." Yi Ling shook her head and sighed. She knew that her family and the distant army in Dingzhou had long become a tool in the battle for the inheritance because of this marriage. If Fan Xian also joined in, naturally. But she didn't want to pay attention to these things. Suddenly, she felt a headache and unhappily furrowed her brows. The second prince stood up and looked at the faint light outside the window. Lost in thought, he said, "If Fan Xian doesn't change, he will only walk into a dead end in the future. If he has the courage to change, perhaps he will suffer a great loss now, but in the future, he and the Fan family can obtain even greater benefits and a more stable peace. This all depends on what he thinks." In the end, he helplessly lowered his head. However, these 2 years have long proven that Fan Xian is a madman who does not act according to common sense. So, I do not have such extravagant hopes. In the eyes of most people in the Qing kingdom, under Fan Xian's gentle and amiable appearance, there was indeed a glimmer of a crazed murderous aura gradually seeping out. It was not talking about the night battles in Jingdou, but the shocking matter of Jingdou's return to the ancestral home. At the cold of the fifth watch, the Fan family's worship to their ancestors began. At noon, this news had already spread to all the large manors. For a moment, countless people were guessing at the subsequent development of the situation and the rise and fall of Fan Xian's desire for power in the court. Just like the second prince, no one could understand why Fan Xian would do this. Although in the past, he only had the identity of the emperor's illegitimate son and had no hope of entering the palace, the identity of an illegitimate son was still an identity. As long as it was not sealed, anything was possible. Furthermore, this identity would certainly be of great use in the future. A long time ago, Chen Pingping had thought that once the Empress Dowager was gone, it was not impossible for Fan Xian to re-enter the ranks of the princes. Fan Xian's actions today had finally branded his name with the brand of the Fan family, cutting off the possibility of his surname being Li. In the eyes of most people, this seemed somewhat foolish or impulsive. Even in the depths of the palace, this news shocked the hearts of many nobles. Lady Shu was transcribing the rare book of Tianyi Pavilion that Fan Xian had sent over with graceful handwriting. Listening to the palace maid's report, she shook her head somewhat sullenly. Lady Ning was in her small courtyard practicing her swordsmanship around a tree. After hearing the news, her face lit up and she praised Fan Xian for having a backbone. In Shufeng Palace, Yi Guipin was watching the third prince practice his calligraphy. Hearing Xing Er's quiet words, she smiled slightly and said nothing. She only looked at her son with a complicated expression. After a while, she pulled her son behind the curtain and quietly told him the biggest news of the day in Jingdou. She spoke very seriously and solemnly. The third prince was startled. At such a young age, he immediately understood many things. His teacher had returned to the family, to a large extent, for his sake. Finally, Yi Guipin said seriously, "Ping Er, you must firmly remember everything that Master Fan has done for you. If you dare to do those things in the future, I will not forgive you." The third prince lowered his head and said nothing. In Guangxin Palace, eldest Princess Li Yunrui, who had always lived in seclusion and rarely left the palace, was the first to hear the news. This beautiful woman paused for a moment and then smiled. As the saying goes, one smile can charm 100 people. Just like this, it actually suppressed the light of the white curtains inside and outside the palace and the light of the jade trees. The palace maid asked cautiously, "Princess, why are you so happy?" The eldest princess slowly withdrew her smile and said very softly, "I suddenly feel that my son-in-law is a very good man. He knows when to stop and when to stop. It is a pity that I have only met him once. Tomorrow, arrange for him and Wan'er to enter the palace. I want to see how young Fan Xian has grown so quickly in the 2 years I have not seen him." The palace maid was startled. Sir Fan Jr.'s actions were clearly too impulsive and did not consider the pros and cons enough. Was the eldest princess happy because of this? Looking at the eldest princess's expression, it was clear that she greatly admired Sir Fan Jr.'s actions. In Hongguang Palace, the Empress Dowager was picking at her rosary beads and muttering something. Old eunuch Hong was bent over to serve at her side. After a long time, the Empress Dowager sighed and said, "That child knows the big picture. It has not been easy." Old eunuch Hong said with a slight hiss, "Sir Fan Jr. is not bad." In the quiet and secluded little building at the back of the royal palace, the Qing Emperor, dressed in a yellow robe, held his hands behind his back. He looked at the yellow-clothed woman in the painting in a daze. A moment later he quietly said, "Our son is indeed more like you. He is very proud. It is not that I don't want him to come back. It is just that he doesn't want to come back. The surname Fan is good. Back then, you and Ida used to call each other brother and sister. Just take it as following your mother's surname." A cold winter breeze blew in through the building and made the painting flutter slightly. The beautiful face of the yellow-clothed woman in the painting twisted slightly. It was as if a mocking smile rose to the corners of her lips. It was as if she was mocking the emperor's words. On the afternoon of the first day of the new year, Fan Xian sat in the carriage heading toward King Jing's manor. This was an old custom between the Fan manor and King Jing's manor for many years. After the new year, there had to be a day chosen for the people of the two manors to gather together. Fan Xian had been away from Danzhou for 3 years and had long gotten used to the strange, intimate relationship between his family and King Jing's manor. Although Hongqing had been miserably grounded for a year because of Fan Xian's good work, Fan Xian knew that this was actually King Jing's ruthless decision to prevent his manor from being dragged into the fight for the throne. The relationship between the two manors had not been affected by the battles between their sons and nephews. The carriage jolted slightly. Wan'er looked at Fan Xian in a daze and didn't speak for a moment. Fan Xian smiled. "If you have anything you want to ask, ask away." "I'm thinking that everyone in Jingdo must be talking about you today," Lin Wan'er said with a smile. "They're all calling you an idiot." Fan Xian smiled even more happily. Suddenly, he fell silent again. A moment later, he looked into his wife's eyes and said seriously, "I can hide it from everyone under heaven, but I won't hide it from you." Lin Wan'er smiled slightly and looked into her husband's eyes. Fan Xian calmly said, "In reality, the reason is very simple. There are only 2 reasons. First, I have always thought of myself as Fan Xian. I was raised by my grandmother from a young age. I will not accept any other surname. I have always been willing to return to my ancestral home and worship my ancestors, so I will do it." Lin Wan'er gently leaned against his arm and felt that his breath was very warm and pure. Second, regardless of whether it was openly supporting the third prince in Jiangnan, killing in all directions in Jingdo, or returning to my ancestral home today, I am showing my determination. Fan Xian lowered his head and glanced at Wan'er's round face. Warmly he said, "Danbo shows one's determination. If one wants to go far, one must show one's determination." "What determination? Who are you showing it to?" Fan Xian was silent. He thought of the conversation he had with the emperor in the royal palace. "Duke of Danbo, Duke of Danbo. I don't want to be the emperor," he calmly said. "Of course, it is for the emperor to see." Lin Wan'er glanced at him worriedly. Although she didn't say anything, Fan Xian knew that she had long seen the future. It was possible that he and the Fan Manor would face a disaster of destruction. Go against the current. If you don't advance, you will fall back. If the boat capsizes, you will die. I understand this principle. Fan Xian tilted his head slightly. "It seems that all the circumstances force me to fight, but the emperor has warned me, so I can only not fight." He smiled and said, Going with the current is, in the end, more comfortable. There are not many people I am afraid of in this world. However, I am still a bit afraid of your uncle, my cheap father. Lin Wanna smiled, but there was still some worry in her smile. But what about the future? The future, Fan Xian said. The emperor can live for at least another 20 years. I have used an unknown future danger to exchange for 20 years of peace, or perhaps 20 years of the emperor's trust. This trade is very worth it. Furthermore, I cannot be ambiguous. I must resolutely and decisively demonstrate my attitude and determination. Even if I stand behind the third prince, it is not enough to convince many people. Fan Xian rubbed the space between his brows and said tiredly, men and women can be ambiguous. If you do this between ruler and official, it is easy for people to die. I believe the emperor will like my decision. There was still something he did not say to his wife. The so-called ambiguity was certainly two-sided. The so-called decision also worked on both sides. Today, he had recognized his ancestors and returned to his ancestral home to express his absolute sincerity to the emperor. He had also seen clearly that the emperor did not want him to take over the world. This reality made Fan Xian relax slightly. After relaxing, there was a sliver of deep worry. The worry was not in the present. Instead, it was in the past. Just as Chen Pingping had confirmed that night, Fan Xian finally confirmed that the emperor had an illness and a heart disease. The carriage stopped in front of King Jing's manor. There were already all kinds of servants waiting outside, welcoming the honored guests from Fan Manor into the manor. Fan Xian led Wan'er and followed behind his father and Lady Lu in. Looking around, the scenery in the manor was the same as before. However, the white gauze on the other side of the lake was not up. Thinking about it, it was winter. How could there be gauze to block out the light? However, Fan Xian tilted his head to look at the gentle Wan'er beside him. He still thought of the time when he first fell in love. A slightly old, angry, joyful and complicated voice rang out, pulling Fan Xian out of this rare and brief moment of happiness. You little dog, you still know to come see me. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.